The old house on the outskirts of the city seemed to be an ideal retreat for a man tired of the hustle and bustle of modern life. From the first moment he walked through his dusty yard and observed the crumbling walls of the house, something inside him told him that this would be his new abode. He had fallen on hard times, and the desolate place offered a kind of silent peace. The house was large, with long hallways and steps that creaked with every step. The air seemed thick, as if he was waiting for something, but the man didn't pay much attention to it. He was accustomed to solitude, and his life had always been a kind of emptiness, only full of work and misery. He did not expect that the house would change him, much less that it would awaken something in him that would haunt him until the end of his days. The man, whose name was Andrew, had acquired the property for a fraction of the original price. It didn't matter that the house was in ruins. He was determined to restore it, and that would be his project. It was all I needed, a purpose. At first, everything seemed normal. The house was full of dust and cobwebs, but nothing he couldn't clean and repair. However, on the second day of his move, while inspecting the basement, something strange happened. When he walked down the creaky stairs, he noticed an antique door that was slightly ajar. I had never seen that door before. It wasn't in the plans of the house, nor in the descriptions the realtor had given her. He decided to investigate. As he approached the door, a strange sensation ran down his spine. Something in the air was heavy, as if something was watching him. But Andrew was not one to be easily intimidated. He decided to open it. As he did so, a deafening creak filled the room, as if the world was complaining about that door opening. On the other side, he found a room that had been locked for many years. It was not a common room. He was completely isolated from the rest of the house, as if he had never been a part of it. The room was empty, save for an old wooden chair, worn by time. But what really gave him a chill was the mirror hanging on the wall. The frame was covered in dust, but what really disturbed him was his reflection. He saw himself, but in a strange way, as if something or someone else was there with him. He didn't flinch. He thought it was just an illusion brought on by the darkness. However, upon closer investigation, he found something even more disturbing. In one corner, under a layer of dust, was a small pile of personal belongings, small memories that clearly weren't his. A pocket watch, a yellowed letter, a couple of crumpled photos. At that moment, the air around him seemed to become denser. Andres looked around, but the feeling of being watched became unbearable. He didn't know why, but he felt that something or someone had been there long before him. Something that I didn't want him to be there. Something that was waiting for him. The first night he spent in the house was strange. Andres felt restless, as if the house were alive, watching him, following his every move. In the early morning, he woke up suddenly, with the feeling that something had changed. There was a shadow in the hallway, a movement he couldn't identify. At first he thought he was dreaming, but when he got up, he realized that the lights in the house were off, and the only thing illuminating the darkness was the faint moonlight coming in through the broken windows. He tried to ignore it, but that nagging sense of being watched began to intensify. He decided to investigate the basement further, and this time he didn't limit himself to the hidden room. He walked down the long hallway, surrounded by walls that creaked as he went. Something inside him told him that he should find out what was happening in that house. Something was not right. That's when she saw it. In the deepest part of the basement, in one of the walls, there was a small crack. The crack was so subtle that it had gone unnoticed, but Andres felt that he could not ignore it. The crack was covered by a layer of dust and mold, but something inside it told him it was important. With trembling hands, Andres touched the crack, and to his surprise, the wall collapsed with a deafening noise. Inside the crack was something that took his breath away. A hidden narrow space covered by a kind of tapestry that had been left behind by someone. The room was full of things, but what disturbed him most was what he found in the center. An old broken bed, with sheets stained with something he couldn't identify. Next to it, on a small table, was a notebook. The notebook was almost intact, with worn and yellowed pages. Andres opened it cautiously. Inside, the pages were full of scribbles. They were notes, but not just any kind of notes. They were full of descriptions about him, about his movements from the moment he had arrived at the house. The details were horrifying. Every room he had visited, every object he had touched, and most terrifying of all, the exact times he had done so. Handwriting became more erratic as time went on. In the last pages, the words began to become incomprehensible, but the last sentences she managed to read were clear. "I saw you arrive, I saw you enter. You will no longer run away." Andres stepped back, feeling as if everything around him began to close. Something was deeply wrong with that house, something that had been there long before him and had never left. Suddenly he heard a noise behind him, a whisper, low and sinister. When he turned, he saw a shadow sliding down the hallway. The figure was blurry, but there was something in his eyes that stared at him, as if it was waiting for him. Andres tried to run, but his legs did not respond. The feeling of panic took hold of him. He couldn't move, he couldn't scream. He could only feel the weight of fear taking hold of him. The figure slowly approached. She was tall, thin, with skin pale as ash and dark eyes like bottomless pits. The figure smiled, and Andres felt time stand still. The man in the basement had been watching him the whole time. He had been there in the shadows waiting for Andres to arrive. The house was not his. It never was. Andres tried to escape, but when he reached the basement door, the figure was there, blocking his exit. His breath was cold, and the darkness around him closed like a heavy cloak. The man in the basement whispered one last word, "Welcome." And with that, the door slammed shut, and the house fell silent. The presence that had been lurking all along vanished, and the house was left alone again, waiting for the next tenant who dared to discover the dark secrets it harbored. In the darkness of the night, a dull roar filled the air. The accident had been brutal. A roar of metal and glass exploding, the sensation of a violent jolt, and then emptiness. Samuel had lost consciousness. The last image in his mind was that of a blinding beacon of light coming from a fast-approaching car. I didn't remember anything else. When he woke up, his body felt strange, heavy, as if he was completely asleep. He tried to move his fingers, but the stiffness was almost unbearable. Where was it? The air was dense, cold. The first thing she noticed was that she wasn't in the hospital. Instead of the cold, white walls of an emergency room, he was reclining on a hard seat in a vehicle. At first, he didn't understand. He was in a funeral car. The smell of wood and what looked like melted wax enveloped him. The dim light came from a low lamp on the roof of the vehicle, barely illuminating the faces of the other passengers. Samuel blinked several times, waiting for his eyes to adjust. The funeral car was in motion, and the shadows inside it danced with the swaying of the road. He looked straight ahead, where the driver seemed not to pay attention to him. The figure was barely visible, shrouded in shadows, and the steering wheel was spinning incessantly, with no human movement to be perceived inside. Samuel tried to speak, but his throat was dry. He looked around. To his right was a figure wrapped in what looked like a black cloak. The face was covered by a white mask, expressionless. A shiver ran down his spine. To his left, a woman with long black hair sat with her eyes closed, with an expression of absolute detachment. He seemed not to notice his presence in the least. The air was permeated with a silence that penetrated the bones. Suddenly, the vehicle went around a sharp curve, and the sound of muffled laughter could be heard in the distance. It was like a vibration in the air, something ethereal, as if it came from a different dimension. Samuel couldn't understand it. I couldn't comprehend what was happening. Everything in his mind seemed to be woven in a tangle of confusion. He looked straight ahead again, and there in the driver's seat there was no face, only a dark figure, the silhouette of a humanoid being who did not seem to move at the pace of the chariot. The vehicle continued its journey as if it had no end. Samuel felt a sudden terror in his chest. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I couldn't be there. The lights flickered, and with each flash he saw something else in the other passengers. Something I couldn't clearly identify. The woman to his left seemed to have changed her position. Now she was staring at him, her eyes empty, like bottomless pits. An intense cold ran through his body, and his breathing became erratic. It was not possible that he was seeing it. Or is it? Suddenly a terrifying thought crossed his mind. He was not alone in the car. At least not in the way I thought so. He looked around once more. The other passengers sat in an eerie calm. No one moved, no one spoke. The two men in the back of the vehicle, both in dark shirts, did not appear to be alive. They were like statues. In the blink of an eye, Samuel noticed something strangely familiar surrounding them. The air no longer smelled of damp or wood. Now it smelled of damp earth, of something rotten and moldy. The feeling of panic enveloped him again. Something was not right. Involuntarily, his hands tried to hold on to the seat. but he noticed that his fingertips were purple, as if he had been motionless for hours. He couldn't move. He felt a knot in his stomach, as if an invisible weight was crushing him. A whisper broke the silence, just a murmur coming from the seat next to him. "Have you noticed?" The voice was low, almost inaudible. Samuel turned quickly to the woman to his left, who was now closer, almost as if she had moved towards him without him noticing. His face showed no emotion, but his presence was imbued with an indescribable air, as if his very soul were broken. "Don't be scared," she said, as if reading her thoughts. "This is the chariot of the dead. All who travel in it no longer belong to the world of the living." Horror flooded him. The woman's words were etched in his mind, and his eyes began to frantically search for a way out. But the vehicle had no windows. It was a lifeless container, a mobile prison. The woman continued in a barely audible whisper, "You have no turning back. The journey has already begun." Samuel tried to get up, but his legs were frozen, as if he couldn't move them. The other passengers watched him with an eerie calm. Nobody did anything. The driver was still guiding the vehicle in the endless darkness. The sounds of the engine and the road mingled with a strange buzzing in his ear, as if everything was a nightmare from which he could not wake up. Suddenly a laugh resounded in his head. She was not human. It was a deep sound which seemed to come from the very bowels of the universe. Samuel tried to cover his ears, but he couldn't stop him. It was as if that laughter was permeated in the air like an eternal curse. The passengers' faces distorted before their eyes. The woman's figure began to fade and form something horrible, something she could not comprehend, but which her instincts told her she should fear. Samuel was trapped in a dimension between life and death. I couldn't understand why or how I had gotten there, but I knew that the sense of danger was more real than ever. Everything around him was beginning to crumble, and the chariot continued to move forward endlessly. Suddenly, a lash of pain ran through his body, as if a torrent of electricity had passed through him. The world began to turn, and his vision became cloudy. At that moment, the figure in front of him in the driver's seat became more tangible. The faceless shadow now stared at him, and the driver's bony, skeletal hands adjusted the steering wheel with terrifying dexterity. "There's no turning back," the figure said, his voice raspy, echoing in his mind. "The dead travel into eternity." Samuel tried to resist, but his mind was no longer responding. The image of the vehicle, the shadows, and the distorted faces were mixed. The awareness of what was happening flooded him completely, but it was too late. Fear got the better of him. I couldn't scream anymore. The funeral cart stopped, and at that moment, a deadly cold surrounded it. The passengers were no longer mere figures. They were grotesque, horrible beings staring at him. Some with empty eyes, others with macabre smiles. Everyone knew what was coming. Samuel was no longer a traveler. He was no longer among the living. At that moment, the car opened, and he knew without a doubt that he would never see the light of day again. He had crossed the threshold. There was no turning back. Eternity awaited him. The icy desert wind blew hard, pushing the sand dunes into the darkest corners of the earth. The expedition of archaeologists had reached the end of their search, but none of them was prepared for what was about to be discovered. The mist kicked up by the wind hid what looked like a giant rock, but as it approached, a peculiar shape began to emerge before the team's eyes. Something buried, but visible, as if it were waiting to be found. The lead archaeologist, Marco Ruiz, was a man of great experience, but even he felt uncomfortable seeing that hidden tomb. It was unlike anything he had encountered in his career. The stone was marked by an inscription in an ancient language, one that he could not decipher, but which somehow seemed to him close. The lines of the inscription formed enigmatic patterns that seemed to move, as if they took on a life of their own with the light of the lanterns. This is not in any of the registers," Marco said, his voice trembling with fascination and unease. "This is something we've never seen before." The team began digging around the tomb. No one questioned what they felt because they were all too engrossed in the wonder of the find. But something in the air began to change, an invisible tension enveloping them as they dug up the lid of the tomb. The shadow seemed to lengthen with each blow, and the air grew thicker. However, the most terrifying moment came when finally, after hours of work, the sarcophagus was uncovered. When he opened it, a thick mist shot out from inside the tomb. It was a cold, almost gelatinous air that permeated his lungs instantly. None of them had ever seen anything like it before. Marco, driven by his own curiosity, reached out and touched the object that rested inside the tomb. Instantly, a wave of visions swept over him. The visions. The vision dragged him into total darkness. In the middle of it, there was an ancient and devastated city. The streets were empty, desolate, covered with dust. There were distant screams, murmurs echoing from the crumbling walls. Marco could not understand what he saw, but terror invaded him. He saw figures crawling among the ruins, diffuse shadows, as if they were beings caught in an endless cycle. Suddenly, one of those shadows approached him. The form was human, but with the skin covered in scars that seemed to be alive, pulsating as if something inside it was struggling to come out. His eyes were two pits of darkness, and a raspy voice murmured something that Marco didn't understand, but that froze him inside. Then the vision faded, but the images lingered in his mind. Marco looked around, desperate to regain his composure, but something inside him had changed. He knew that he had unleashed something that should not have been touched. One of his companions, Alejandro, approached to examine the object. Without hesitation, he touched it. As soon as he did, he fell to the ground, writhing. He screamed with an unearthly intensity, as if something was piercing him inside, a scream that sounded as if it were eternal, and that was repeated in his mind. The curse. With each passing moment, the curse began to seep into the lives of the expedition members. The days that followed were marked by strange events. Those who stood near the tomb began to experience episodes of unexplained terror. Some saw visions of the future, other times, memories of the past that they had never lived. They were all caught up in their own fears and heartaches, as if each was being haunted by something they could not escape. Marco began to lose control. At night, he saw shadows sliding down the walls of his tent. He felt the cold, clammy hands of someone touching him in the dark. He heard whispers calling his name, voices asking him to undo what he had started. But he was doing it in a language he had never heard before. Worst of all, the shadows resembled the figures he had seen in the tomb, as if those entities were watching his every move. Each of the members of the expedition began to suffer the same. Alejandro could no longer sleep without screaming. Sarah, another of the archaeologists, saw her reflection in a pond, and when she looked at herself, she saw that her face was aged, her eyes empty, as if she had lived a whole life in seconds. The vision disappeared when he stepped away from the water, but the feeling of having seen his future remained. The terror began to overflow when stranger phenomena began to occur. In the middle of the night, everyone woke up feeling bitterly cold. The tomb, despite having closed, seemed to be emanating something, as if it were alive. The team members began to have vivid nightmares, all related to the vision of the desolate city, but more intense, more real. It seemed as if somehow the past was merging with the present. One night, Marco woke up suddenly, feeling a cold presence beside him. As he opened his eyes, he saw a being staring at him from the corner of his tent, a disfigured figure with glowing red eyes, watching him in silence. Fear paralyzed him, unable to move. The figure slowly stretched out his hand towards him, and Marco felt the heavy air almost as if he could touch it. The light from his flashlight flickered before going out completely, and in the darkness, he heard the murmur of voices intensifying. They were voices of despair, voices of the future, of the past, of all who had ever stood near the unmarked grave. Marco finally got up, but as he did so, he saw that his companions were no longer in the tent. The feeling of emptiness was overwhelming, as if everything I had ever known was fading away. The few survivors attempted to leave the site, but the curse had already spread beyond the camp's borders. The desert seemed to consume everything. Marco, exhausted and on the verge of madness, tried to reach a safe place, but the tomb had marked him forever. Finally, Marco found a way to break the cycle. He had to seal the sarcophagus again, close it forever. But in doing so, the vision that had tormented him for so long caught up with him for the last time. The ruined city awaited him, and with it the end he had unleashed. The moment he closed the sarcophagus, the future began to fade, and silence reigned. The tomb, however, would never disappear. The curse would remain, waiting for whoever would discover it again. The cycle would keep repeating, until someone else touched the cursed object. And when that happened, the darkness would return, bringing with it terror and despair forever. The story of the nameless tomb would continue, waiting to be unearthed once again. The house was quiet, as was to be expected at that time of night. A deep, almost oppressive silence that invaded every corner of the house. Joseph was in his bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Since his wife, Anna, had died, everything had changed. The house was no longer the same, and the emptiness left by it was unbearable. Everything in her life seemed to have a gray tinge, a sense of loss that couldn't be dissipated, no matter how hard she tried. Every night in her bed, she felt that something was missing, something that she could never recover. That night, however, the air was different, heavier. The clock struck 3 o'clock in the morning, and Jose still couldn't find comfort. Suddenly, the phone began to ring, interrupting the stillness. It was an unusual sound in the house, as rarely did anyone call him at that hour. The sound of the ringing of the call was almost deafening in the silence, as if it was marked by some kind of foreshadowing. Jose, confused and somewhat frightened, sat up on the bed and looked at the phone. He didn't recognize the number on the screen, but something inside him made him feel like he had to answer. Maybe he thought it was a mistake, some kind of joke from someone playing on his pain, but the truth was that he was too curious and at the same time scared to ignore the call. Breathing heavily, he picked up the phone. "Hello," he said, his voice trembling, hardly knowing why he said it. At first, there was only absolute silence, as deep as there was in the house. Joseph frowned, wondering if it was a joke, until he heard a soft breath as if someone was on the other end of the line. A familiar breath, but one that I did not fully recognize. It was trembling, somewhat broken breathing, as if she were struggling to stay calm. And then the voice, soft and muffled, emerged into the earpiece. The voice that Joseph never thought he would hear again. The voice of Hannah, his late wife. It was unmistakable. "Jose, help me." The whole world stopped for an instant. His heart stopped in his chest. Anna's figure, her image, her voice had disappeared from her life months ago. But now, somehow, she was back. The feeling of terror invaded him completely. Was it possible? How could it be her? "Anna? No, this can't be happening," he said, his voice trembling, feeling his mind fogging up, but still clinging to the idea that it might be a hallucination or some kind of trick. "Jose, please help me. I'm trapped. I can't get out," Anna's voice told him with palpable desperation. Joseph looked around the room as if expecting to see something, some hint that he was dreaming. Everything was in place. Everything seemed normal. But the feeling that something strange, something dark, was beginning to settle over the house did not leave him calm. The call continued, and his wife's voice did not stop asking for help. Panic began to rise through his chest, choking his breath. I didn't know what to think, what to believe, but I had to do something. "Anna, where are you? What's going on?" he asked, almost begging, looking at every corner of the room as if she could appear out of nowhere in front of him. In the house," replied the voice, which now sounded more distorted, more trembling, as if something were interfering with the communication. Anne's voice died briefly away, and Joseph could hear some strange noises in the background, low noises as if someone is walking through the house. His breathing quickened and his hands began to sweat. Was he listening to what he thought he was hearing? "Who's there?" he asked, almost unable to articulate the words. The response was a low laugh, a deep, malevolent sound that chilled Joseph's blood. It was a laugh that didn't belong to his wife, but to something else, something he couldn't understand, something that had no form. A shiver ran down his spine. The phone began to emit a series of strange sounds as if the call was being interfered with by something else, and then the voice returned, but now it was much deeper, more ominous. "Jose, don't go. Don't go." The warning only intensified the fear in his chest. Something was wrong. Something dark and sinister had taken the place where he had previously lived with Anna. Joseph got out of bed, the phone still pressed to his ear, and with slow steps, began to walk toward the bedroom door. The sound of the ringing of the call, the buzzing on the line, followed as a constant reminder that something was wrong. Every step he took toward the door was a struggle, a battle between the fear that built up inside him and the need to understand what was happening. He sat on the edge of the bed, then got up again, and with trembling hands began to walk down the hall. The house was dark, as it always was at that time of night. Every creak of the floor beneath his feet seemed to resonate as a sign that something was lurking in the shadows. The house, which had once been his home, now seemed a strange and uninhabited place, full of presences that could not be seen, but that were felt in every corner. With the phone still in his hand, Jose approached the lobby and saw something that made him stop in his tracks. A figure was gliding down the dark hallway, a figure he couldn't clearly distinguish but which looked familiar. It seemed to be flowing, as if it wasn't walking but rather gliding. He couldn't see his face, but he felt the presence, as if that figure was watching him. "Anna, is that you?" he said, his voice trembling as if he were looking for some kind of comfort, something that would give meaning to what he was experiencing. The figure paused for a moment and then faded into the darkness. Fear filled Jose's chest, but even with the phone in his hand, he could not take his eyes off the hallway. A loud knock on the front door broke the silence, a sound so loud that it echoed throughout the house. Joseph took a step back, scared, as his mind tried to process everything that was happening. He slowly approached the door, his breathing being the only thing he could hear. When he reached the door, an icy cold ran through his skin, and a shudder shook him completely. He opened the door cautiously, but there was no one on the other side. Nothing, just the cold night wind. He looked back into the house, and that's when he saw him. In the hallway, a face that belonged to someone who couldn't be real. It was not Anna's face or anyone he knew. It was something else, something moving towards him, slowly approaching. The face was pale, lifeless, with eyes that seemed empty, but with an expression of despair. The hair was messy, and the mouth, which moved slowly, uttered words that Joseph could not understand. At that point, the call was abruptly cut off. The phone fell from his hands, and he stepped back, staring in horror at the figure fading into the darkness. The house was quiet again, too much silence, as if everything was suspended in the air, waiting for something else to happen. Joseph, paralyzed by fear, did not know what to do. Was his mind playing a cruel joke on him? Was it a dream? No, what I was experiencing could not be real, but the feeling that something dark had invaded her home was so strong that she couldn't ignore it. He felt a cold presence, the feeling that he was not alone, and at that moment he understood everything. The call, the figure, the voice of Anna. She hadn't been asking for help. She had been a warning. The house was now being occupied by something else, something that should not be there. The door to the hall slammed shut. The lights flickered and went out. Joseph looked around, completely surrounded by darkness. He was no longer alone. It was a dark, cold night, with the wind rustling through the branches of the trees, and the lights of the city barely illuminating the distant horizon. The journalist, Samuel Lopez, was prepared for what he hoped would be one more story in his career. He had covered stories of all kinds, from political scandals to crime events, but nothing had prepared him for what he was going to experience that night in the old San Antonio asylum. This place, abandoned more than 3 decades ago, was known in the city for the strange disappearances that occurred at the end of the 70s. For years, it was rumored that patients at the asylum had disappeared without a trace. No one knew what exactly had happened, but the stories circulating spoke of shadows, murmurs in the hallways, and inexplicable presences. Samuel had heard of all these legends, but to him, none of it was anything more than superstitions. He wasn't afraid, but he couldn't deny that something about the atmosphere that night made him uncomfortable. With his flashlight in hand, he advanced through the neglected garden of the asylum. The rusty iron doors creaked as they opened, as if the building itself were waking from a long sleep. Samuel went in, and a shiver ran down his spine. The air was heavy, dense, as if something else was breathing in that place. The empty corridors greeted him with an overwhelming silence, broken only by his own footsteps echoing on the creaky wooden floor. The asylum had an eerie atmosphere, with worn walls, broken windows, and doors that seemed to be waiting to be opened. Every corner of the place was covered in dust, but there was something else, something I couldn't identify. Samuel kept walking, his flashlight illuminating the damp-covered walls. I was looking for something. Evidence, clues, anything that could explain the disappearances. He had read all the available reports, but nothing indicated that there was a clear culprit. What was said was that the patients who disappeared had never been found, and the stories about their last moments varied. But they all agreed that something or someone was behind those disappearances. As he went along, Samuel began to notice something strange. In each corridor he walked, he felt a slight pressure in the air, as if something was watching him. At first, he thought it was his mind playing tricks due to the natural fear he felt in that place. But soon the sensations became more intense. The sound of his own footsteps began to distort, as if something else was walking beside him. even though no one was around. Suddenly, he stopped in his tracks. His breathing accelerated and his heart began to pound. In the darkness, something was moving. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper reached his ear, something like a, "Go away." But when he turned to look, there was nothing. The flashlight trembled in his hand, but his mind remained steady. He told himself that he must continue, that he was an experienced journalist and that nothing could scare him. However, as he made his way through the corridors of the asylum, things began to get worse. The air grew denser and darkness closed in around him. Every time he turned a corner, he felt that something was following him, something sliding behind him, barely perceptible. Each creak of the building seemed more ominous, and the echo of his footsteps was now mingled with inaudible whispers coming from all directions. In one of the rooms he found, an old wooden door opened with a low creak. Samuel pushed her cautiously and went inside. The room was empty, but in one of the corners there was an abandoned wheelchair covered in dust and cobwebs. On an impulse, Samuel approached her, moving her slightly. It was then that he saw it. A shadow, dark and elongated, slid down the wall, moving rapidly. Samuel watched her, paralyzed. It wasn't a shadow cast by his flashlight, but something else, something he couldn't identify, but which filled him with a visceral terror. A shudder ran through his body. The air seemed to become even heavier, and a pressure in his chest made him breathe heavily. The feeling of being watched intensified. He turned toward the door, but it slammed shut, echoing throughout the building. Samuel tried to open it, but it was locked. Something or someone was catching him in that place. Suddenly, he heard footsteps behind him, soft but steady, getting closer and closer. He turned around, but there was nothing. Only the darkness and his breath that resounded in his ears. However, the steps continued. The sound was clear and close. It was not his imagination. Something was following him, something moving with him, adjusting to his movements, waiting for the right moment to catch him. Fear began to take hold of him, and for a moment he thought about giving up, about running away, but something kept him there, an invisible force that kept him anchored to that place. Suddenly, a soft, raspy voice whispered in his ear, as if coming from deep within the asylum. "We know what you fear, what you have come for. You can't escape us." Samuel felt a chill run down his spine. The voice was charged with indescribable evil, and it made his skin crawl. It was as if the very walls of the asylum were speaking to him, as if the whole building had a life of its own. With his eyes bulging, Samuel began to run, banging on the walls and opening doors desperately. The corridor seemed to lengthen endlessly, and the doors he was trying to open were closed. The building wouldn't let him escape, as if he had absolute control over it. The footsteps continued to echo in his back, getting closer and closer, until a cold sweat covered his forehead. Reaching a staircase at the end of the hallway, Samuel hurried upstairs, but something stopped him. A shudder ran through her body as she noticed that the shadows around her seemed to lengthen and take shapes, human figures, but distorted, deformed, as if the souls of the missing patients had been trapped in the asylum. The shadows stretched towards him, his invisible arms trying to touch him, to grab him. A cold hand touched his shoulder. Samuel screamed, but no sound came out of his mouth. He turned quickly, finding himself face to face with a pale figure, empty-eyed and a face twisted with suffering. The figure smiled, and its lips slowly parted, revealing a row of sharp teeth. Fear paralyzed Samuel. He couldn't move. He couldn't think. He could only watch as the figure watched him, as if he was devouring him with his gaze. "You're in our house now," the figure whispered in a deep, guttural voice, "and you can never leave." The darkness enveloped him completely, and Samuel disappeared into the shadows like all the others before him. The next day, journalists and police arrived at the asylum after receiving an anonymous call. They found his recording equipment on the ground intact, but Samuel had disappeared without a trace. There were no signs of a fight, or that he had fled. All that remained was the feeling that something terrible had happened that night, and that the entity that inhabited the asylum was still there, waiting for its next victim. Samuel Lopez was never spoken of again, but those who dare to approach the doors of the San Antonio asylum claimed to hear the footsteps of someone else walking in the shadows. It was a gray afternoon, one that did not presage anything out of the ordinary. Jonas, a 34-year-old man, didn't usually think too much about the supernatural, nor did he believe in legends or ghost stories. His life was simple, structured. He had lost his wife a year ago in a car accident, and since then, He had dedicated himself to maintaining his daily routine, not wanting to look back too much. However, that day, something in the air seemed different. The fog seemed thicker and the shadows on the walls seemed to move inexplicably. It wasn't the first time he'd seen strange things since Laura's death, but he'd never paid much attention to it. Until that day. Jonah had been looking for something to fill the void left by his beloved's departure, something to distract him from the heavy burden of memories that suffocated him every night. That's when he saw the sign. Antiquities of the West. The shop seemed to have been there for centuries, its facade aged and its windows covered in the dust of time. It was the kind of place that, if it weren't for curiosity, one would avoid. Inside, the air was dense, laden with quiet stories, with objects that seemed to whisper dark secrets. Jonah walked between the shelves, watching without really seeing, until something called him. A mirror, framed in an aged gold, with a design so intricate that it seemed impossible that it could have been made by a human hand. The reflection in the glass was strange. His face was not visible, only a faint distortion. His heart beat a little faster, and for an instant a chill ran down his spine. What kind of mirror was this? The store owner, a man with a wrinkled face and cloudy eyes, approached silently. "That mirror has a story," he said, his voice raspy as if coming from the bowels of the earth. "They say it's been passed from hand to hand, and every time the person who owns it sees things they shouldn't see." Jonah looked at him, skeptical. "Little things like what?" "Figures, presences," murmured the owner. "Figures who are not in the room, but who are getting closer. Some called it the mirror of death, but everyone has their own experience with it." Jonah laughed, uncomfortable, not really believing what the man was saying. "How much does it cost?" The owner smiled unsettlingly. "It's a valuable object, but if you really want it, I can leave it to you for a reasonable price." Jonah paid without much thought. Perhaps in his subconscious, what he was looking for was not just the mirror, but something that would disconnect him from his pain, something that would distract him from his constant feeling of emptiness. He took it home that same afternoon, placing the mirror in the main living room, just in front of the window where the shadows at nightfall could play with the reflections. The first night, Jonah didn't notice anything strange. He sat in front of the mirror several times, watching the reflection of the furniture and the fading light outside the window. But something began to change the next day. The image reflected in the mirror seemed altered. It wasn't obvious at first, but when I looked closer, I could see fuzzy shapes that didn't belong in the room, shadowy figures of subtle, barely discernible movements. He thought it was his mind, affected by fatigue, playing tricks with him. But the following nights were different. The figure began to be clearer. At first, it was just a human-shaped shadow that was silhouetted on the glass. Then it seemed to move, getting a little closer each night. Jonah, who had always been logical, rational, began to feel uncomfortable. I couldn't stop looking at the mirror. He couldn't help but feel that something was watching him from the other side of the glass. It was not a simple reflection. It was not a dream. The figure in the mirror had vague outlines, but it was evident that it was a person, tall, thin, with a dark cloak. At night, the shadow seemed to move with an eerie slowness, moving slowly, almost at the same pace as his breathing. Jonah closed his eyes one night, but he couldn't help but open them. The figure was closer, now barely a meter away from him in the reflection. His mind struggled to rationalize what he saw. "It's just a trick of light," he thought, but he couldn't look away. There was something in that reflection that held him captive. Panic began to settle in his chest every time he approached that mirror. Why couldn't he get away? Why did he feel that something was drawing him to him, as if he was being called from another world? As the days passed, the figures in the mirror became clearer. He was no longer just a shadow. She was a woman, ethereal-looking, with long hair that seemed to float around her. His eyes, empty with emotion, watched Jonah with an intensity that paralyzed him. Sometimes he could hear whispers, though he couldn't understand the words. They seemed to come from everywhere and yet from nowhere at the same time. It was as if the air itself were impregnated with a cursed prescription. Jonah tried to cover the mirror, but every time he did, he woke up the next day to find it uncovered, as if nothing had happened. The figure in the mirror not only got closer each night, but it seemed more alive, more real. Somehow she knew that he was watching her, that he felt her, and when he looked at him, she would get a step closer. One night, Jonah decided not to sleep. He spent hours staring at the mirror. waiting to see what would happen if he didn't close his eyes. The figure, that spectral woman, began to move quickly. As soon as the clock struck midnight, she began to rise, and Jonah could see his hands reaching out to the glass. The shadow, or whatever it was, touched the mirror and the glass froze. The air became dense, heavy, as if time itself had stopped. Jonah got up in terror and took a step back, but it wasn't enough. Suddenly his body was paralyzed. The contours of the figure in the mirror began to overflow, stretching, taking the form of a human silhouette slowly emerging towards him. The woman in the mirror was no longer just a shadow. I was there, standing in front of him, as if I had gone through reality itself. What are you?" Jonah managed to whisper, his lips dry. The woman did not answer, but raised her hand. An absolute cold ran through his body. His vision began to blur. Suddenly, Jonah understood. The mirror didn't just show reflections, it was a portal. A portal to the other side, a step towards death. And that figure, that entity, had been waiting for him. Terror overwhelmed him, but he couldn't move. He couldn't scream. The woman raised her other hand, pointing to the mirror. Reality began to crumble, and Jonah felt the essence of his being slowly drain away. The figure smiled at him, an empty smile that ran cold in the blood. And in that instant, Jonah knew that he could no longer escape. The house that had been his refuge was now his prison, and the mirror was his sentence. The woman touched him, and the darkness absorbed him. There was no shouting. There was no resistance. Just an endless emptiness. The next morning, the antique shop closed. The owner disappeared, and the mirror again became part of the store. No one knew who had bought it this time. No one could guess who would be the next victim of the mirror of death, because the mirror did not forget. It was a gray day when Daniel and Laura decided to escape the hustle and bustle of the city. After months of constant stress, they decided that all they needed was the fresh air of the forest and the tranquility of a cabin away from everything. A couple of days, just the two of them, surrounded by nature, where they could relax without worries. The cabin they rented was in a small, secluded corner, where there were no houses nearby and hardly any phone signals. The road meandered between tall trees that towered like giants, mostly covering the sunlight. When they arrived, they realized how far away everything really was. There was not a store, not a sign of human life for miles around. The cabin was small, rustic but cozy. Outside, time seemed to have stopped, as if it were a refuge forgotten by all. "This is perfect," Laura said, dropping her suitcase on the dusty porch floor. "We need this. Time to disconnect." Daniel smiled, though he couldn't deny that something in the air was strange to him. There was something unsettling about the stillness of the place. But he ignored it, thinking it was just his mind burdened by the pressures of the city. What he didn't know was that the calm they longed for would be interrupted by something much more terrifying. The cabin had the essentials: a fireplace that crackled softly, a kitchenette, and a couple of cozy rooms. As they settled in, Daniel and Laura felt more relaxed, forgetting the stresses of work and everyday life. But soon, the first shadows of uneasiness began to appear. That night, after a quiet dinner by the fire, they retired to their room. As Laura settled into bed, Daniel leaned out of the window, looking out the forest around the cabin. The full moon was high in the sky, but it wasn't enough to illuminate the thickness of the trees. "I couldn't help but feel a sense of being watched, even though I couldn't see anything." "Is everything okay?" asked Laura from the bed. "Yes, just the silence is so absolute here," Daniel replied, closing the curtain and turning off the light. But when he tried to sleep, Daniel's sleep was interrupted by strange noises, a distant creak, as if something or someone is moving through the trees. At first he thought it might be an animal, but then the sound repeated, closer, as if someone was approaching the cabin. Daniel tried to ignore it, blaming it on the stress and loneliness of the place. But the creaks continued until a loud bang made him get out of bed. "Did you hear that?" Daniel whispered, looking at Laura, who was already awake. She nodded, looking out the window. "Yes, as if someone is nearby. Should we go and look?" "Number. Let's better stay here and check tomorrow. It's very dark outside." Laura wasn't so sure. Something in the air kept her alert, but she trusted Daniel, and the cabin was safe, or so she thought. The next morning, they didn't mention the noises of the night. The light of day brought with it a false sense of security. They decided to take a walk in the woods, exploring the surroundings. As they walked, Daniel felt the strange sensation of being watched again. Every time he turned his head, he saw nothing, but the feeling lingered, as if something was watching them from the shadows of the trees. I don't know, Laura. This place scares me a little. Perhaps we should have looked for something closer to civilization. Come on, don't be paranoid. It's just a forest and we're all alone. There's something soothing about this silence, Laura replied, though she also felt a growing discomfort in her chest. As they moved deeper into the forest, the sound of their footsteps and the breeze moving the leaves of the trees were the only things that broke the silence. But as they advanced, something else began to add tension to the atmosphere. Some branches creaked near them, and when they looked, they saw nothing and no one. Who else could be here? Muttered Daniel, looking around more nervously. Don't worry, it's just an animal. Let's keep walking, Laura said, though her words lacked the confidence she had had before. By the time they returned to the cabin, night had already begun to fall and the sense of unease intensified. That night, terror did not take long to arrive. During dinner, Laura and Daniel tried to talk about anything to distract themselves, but something in the air made the words feel empty. It was after dinner, when Daniel sat down in the chair by the fireplace, that they heard a creak again, but this time louder, almost above their heads. The two looked at each other, their eyes full of dread. What was that? Asked Laura, her voice trembling. I think something is on the ceiling. Daniel got up quickly, looking up anxiously. It's impossible. The noises continued. As they intensified, they began to hear what seemed like footsteps dragging on the ceiling, heavy as if someone was walking on the wooden beams. The thought that someone could be there watching them caused terror to take hold of them. We have to get out of here, Laura said, visibly terrified. But we can't. We are very far from anywhere. We have no other options. Maybe it's just the wind or an animal. We're going to close everything, lock the gates, and wait for it to happen. Paranoia began to creep into their minds, as the sense that they were not alone became more and more palpable. Upon returning to their room, the sound of something hitting the windows made them jump in fear. The window. Look at the window, Laura whispered, pointing to the window. Something dark and blurry moved on the other side. Fear gripped them as the sound of scratching on the window continued. Laura tried to take a closer look, but she couldn't see anything. However, he felt that something was stalking them from the outside. We have to go now, exclaimed Daniel, clutching his jacket in despair. Come on, Laura, come on. But when they both tried to open the door to escape, something stopped them. The door wouldn't budge. It was sealed from the outside. Panic set in when they discovered they couldn't open the door. They tried with all their might, but the lock seemed to have been locked from the outside. Laura, her face pale, began to breathe rapidly, her mind working at 1,000 miles an hour. Daniel stared at her desperately, trying to find a solution, but all he saw was darkness and the creaking of wood around them. We can't stay here. Something is not right. What the hell is going on? Said Daniel, sweating and looking anxiously into every corner of the room. Suddenly, the lamplight went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. The creaking of the wood coming from the ceiling now felt closer, as if someone was slowly descending, approaching them. Both of them, paralyzed with fear, approached the window, but something in the air told them that looking outside would only make things worse. We have to get out of here no matter what it takes, Laura said in a trembling voice. Laura began to bang on the window with all her might, but the glass would not give way. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the darkness outside, its dark outline silhouetted against the dim moonlight. Daniel screamed, but the voice choked in his throat as he saw the silhouette moving through the trees, watching them mercilessly. What is that? Who's there? Asked Laura, her voice breaking. There was no response, only the growing sense that something horrible was about to happen. The figure stood there, motionless, its eyes fixed on them. Panic began to engulf them as they tried to find a way out, but the feeling that they were being watched only intensified. Help me, shouted Laura, finally giving in to the terror that consumed her. But there was no response. The world seemed to have stopped, and the only sound was the rustling of trees swaying in the wind. Without warning, the figure disappeared into the trees. Daniel breathed heavily, trying to process what he had just seen. The figure that had been lurking around the hut seemed to fade into nothingness, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Something was not right. There was something they couldn't see, but around them, like a presence seeping through the shadows, lurking. The clock on the wall made an almost imperceptible sound, but loud enough to break the absolute silence. Laura and Daniel looked at each other in terror, the words getting stuck in their throats. We can't stay here. Daniel muttered as he tried to think of a way out. We have to find a way out. With their hearts racing, they began to look for any possible way to escape. But it was at that moment that the door burst open, as if something had unlocked it from the outside. Moonlight immediately poured in, illuminating the room in eerie shadows. The figure was gone, but the sense of danger was stronger than ever. Without thinking twice, Daniel and Laura left the cabin in a hurry, running into the woods without looking back. The ground was wet and branches hit their faces as they ran frantically. They could hear footsteps behind them, the rustling of branches and leaves moving. They didn't know if it was the figure chasing them or something more sinister, but they didn't dare to look. "Run, Laura! Run!" shouted Daniel, feeling his breath ragged. Anxiety consumed them, and every second it seemed like something was catching up with them. But when they turned to see if there was anything behind it, the figure was gone. There was no trace of anything, only the thick fog that began to envelop them. The trees, which had once seemed harmless, now stood like dark giants, and the darkness of the forest seemed to devour them. There was no visible path, no lights, only the thick gloom that surrounded them. Daniel and Laura reached the edge of the forest, where the road seemed distant as if they could never reach it. The feeling of dread consumed them, but at that moment, Laura fell to her knees, exhausted and trembling. "What's going on? Why can't we get out of here?" sobbed Laura, looking out over the woods where the shadows moved as if they were alive. Daniel tried to comfort her, but he also felt the growing despair. Something was catching them, something much bigger than them, something they couldn't understand. Suddenly, a heart-rending scream echoed through the air, a voice that was not human. Something appeared on the threshold of the trees, a tall figure shrouded in darkness. His face was an indescribable shadow, but his eyes, two empty abysses, shone with a frightful intensity. The figure was watching them, and something in his eyes made their skin stand on end. "No, it can't be," shouted Daniel, as the figure slowly advanced towards them. Fear paralyzed them. They didn't know what that thing was or where it had come from. They only knew that they could not escape. The air around them thickened, as if time itself had stopped. The figure raised his arm, pointing at them, and a barely audible whisper could be heard in the wind. Laura and Daniel's name was whispered in their ears like a distant echo. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet began to shake, and an invisible force pushed them to the ground. Fear turned to absolute terror. They were no longer in the same place. They had been transported to another world, a gloomy and dark place, where the trees twisted into grotesque shapes, and the air was thick and oppressive. The empty-eyed figure slowly approached them, its shadow enveloping them, and with one swift motion took them, absorbing them in the darkness. The cabin, the forest, everything disappeared in a breath, and all that remained was the sound of the wind, carrying with it the whispers of those who had been observed, until they could never be reached. The wind was blowing hard that autumn afternoon when Clara arrived at the house. She had decided to call her new home. After months of a hectic life, of pain that he could not let go, he finally sat behind the wheel of his car, looking towards the horizon as the last light of the day slowly disappeared. The house was all he had left, a desperate option, a way to escape from everything he had left behind. He needed peace, some calm that would allow him to start over. The house was imposing in its antiquity, with stone walls that seemed to have stood the test of centuries. The glass windows were tall and narrow, as if they wanted to see the world but at the same time avoid it. The wooden door creaked as he pushed it open, and Clara felt a strange vibration in the air, a sense of something watching. He shook his head, trying to ignore the thought. Perhaps it was just the fear of the unknown, of what he had not yet had time to explore. At first, the days at home seemed normal. Clara spent her mornings unpacking and cleaning, getting used to the noises of the old house, the creaking of the wood under her feet, the wind whispering through the cracks in the windows. None of that troubled her. But one night, everything changed. She was lying on her bed when a murmur under the door of her room woke her up. At first, he thought it was the wind, but then he made out words. Those were his own words. He heard fragments of a conversation that he did not remember having, phrases that sounded familiar, but that he did not know where they came from. He got out of bed, his heart pounding in his chest. He approached the door cautiously, the heavy air of inexplicable tension. He opened the door slowly, but no one was there. There was no trace of what he had heard. A hallucination? She thought, taking a breath. but something inside her knew it wasn't. Panic began to slowly rise in his chest. The house was not normal. Something strange was happening. From that night on, the echoes continued. They were not always the same words, nor the same phrases. Sometimes echoes would come from the kitchen as she cooked. Other times they were in the hallway, muttering in a language she didn't understand, but somehow made her feel trapped, as if those voices were coming from a deep, dark place beyond the visible. She began to notice that the echoes were not only repeating what she had said in the past few days, but also what had not yet happened. One afternoon, while cleaning the windows in the main room, she overheard a conversation that left her cold. It was his own voice speaking to someone, but that someone wasn't there. Clara felt as if the ground under her feet was crumbling. In the echo, he could clearly hear his own words saying something he had never said, a phrase he had not yet predicted. This is just the beginning. What is to come is much worse. She tried to ignore it, to think that maybe she was just scared, but each time the echoes became clearer, more terrifying. And worst of all, they were not only talking about the past, but also about the future, about events that had not yet happened, but that somehow she knew, as if she had already lived them. The noises increased, filling every corner of the house, but the worst of all was that I couldn't escape them. They were in every room, in every corner. The echoes of his own life, his thoughts, his fears, his conversations, all floating in the air, waiting to be heard. In the early morning of a day that she did not know if she had arrived or if she was still part of the nightmare, Clara heard something that paralyzed her. It was a complete conversation, a conversation between herself and another voice, a voice she didn't know, a masculine voice, soft but authoritative, and every word he uttered was like a sharp knife, poking his mind. The voice asked her something that left her cold. "Are you ready to face what you have unleashed?" Clara got out of bed, feeling the weight of fear taking over her body. Something was terribly wrong with that house, something I couldn't comprehend. The echoes spoke not only of things that had not yet happened, but also of things that Clara had forgotten, moments that she herself had wanted to leave behind. Echoes of her childhood, of her family, of her first love. Everything was mixed in a whirlwind of memories and fears. The house seemed to know her more than she did. And with each new echo, the more it took hold of his mind, the more reality vanished. One night, after having heard another frightful echo, he dared to go out into the back garden. He thought that fresh air could clear his mind, give him some clarity. However, when he arrived at the garden, he noticed something strange. The shadows of the house seemed to stretch longer than they should, as if the night itself had warped around it. Clara felt a shudder run through her body, but she couldn't go back. I was trapped, but I didn't know why. Suddenly, the echoes became more intense, closer. It was as if the house was alive, breathing through those murmurs. The male voice spoke to her again, this time with greater force, with more power. "The house has collected all your emotions, your fears, your deepest desires. Nothing you do can escape. This is your prison. You can't run away from yourself." Fear enveloped her completely. Clara began to run, but she could not escape. Every step she took, the echoes followed. The walls of the house seemed to close in on her as if they were absorbing her. Memories and voices melted into hellish chaos, overflowing her mind, drowning her. The house wouldn't let her go. She couldn't get rid of her. Finally, Clara found what she had been looking for, the way out. She ran towards the front door, wishing with all her soul for it to be over. But upon getting there, the door closed on its own, as if it was being pushed from within. The walls rumbled with distorted echoes, and Clara knew at that moment that she could not escape. The house had completely absorbed her. The house was already part of it. The last voice she heard before everything turned dark was hers, her words echoing in her mind with terrifying clarity. "I will never be able to escape this." The house, with its echoes, swallowed his soul, as it did all the souls that dared to enter its darkness. No one else came back in, but the voices continued echoing through the house, repeating the same phrases, the same memories, trapped in an endless loop. And so the House of Echoes remained, waiting for the next person who, like Clara, thought might start over. A group of explorers was gathered in a small cabin on the outskirts of a forgotten village, deep in a dark and dense jungle. No one knew for sure how old the cave they had decided to explore was. It was not marked on maps, nor was it mentioned in the villagers' accounts, but rumors of its existence had reached their ears in curious ways. No one who had gone there had ever returned to tell their story. And that mystery, that shadow in the depths, was more than enough to ignite curiosity in the adventurers. The expedition was composed of 5 people, each with specific skills and knowledge. Luis, the leader of the group, was an experienced geologist who had explored various rock formations around the world. Marta, the youngest on the team, was a biologist with a special talent for studying underground ecosystems. Jorge, a former military man, had been recruited because of his survival prowess and tactical skills. Isabel, a photographer and journalist, was there to document the entire journey and capture the evidence of the inexplicable. Finally, there was Daniel, an old friend of Luis, who had agreed to join out of a simple passion for the unknown, although he did not share the same adventurous energy as the rest. They were standing in front of the cave entrance, a large crack in the rock that seemed to swallow everything around it. The icy wind blowing from within was but a harbinger of what awaited them in the depths. The air was laden with thick humidity and a feeling of tightness that made them feel as if they were being watched. Luis gave the signal, and one by one they began to enter the darkness. At first the cave seemed calm. His footsteps echoed on the walls, and the echo lengthened strangely, as if the cave had a life of its own. The light from the flashlights they carried did not illuminate more than a few meters, which increased the feeling of being lost in an endless labyrinth. The walls were covered with moss and lichens, and the air was permeated with a rancid and unpleasant smell. As they advanced, the corridors seemed to narrow, forcing them to walk closer to each other. Suddenly, Marta stumbled upon something. As he looked down, he discovered a strange mark on the ground, a series of symbols carved deep into the rock, so old that they seemed to crumble when touched. "Look at this," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "These are not common symbols. They seem rituals, as if someone had left some kind of warning." Luis bent down to examine the marks. It makes no sense. He shouldn't be here," he murmured, his eyes sweeping over the unusual figure. Isabel began to photograph, and the flash of the camera lit up the walls for a moment. At that moment, something strange happened. There seemed to be a flicker of light at the bottom of the tunnel, a fleeting silhouette that appeared and disappeared so quickly that no one could make out what it was. Fear began to settle in their hearts. "Did anyone else see that?" asked Daniel, his voice barely audible, as if he feared breaking the silence that had gripped the cave. "We must move on," Luis replied, with a firmness that could not hide his growing concern. However, Marta and Jorge seemed undecided. The fear was there, palpable in the air, but his drive to unravel the secrets of the cave was stronger. They continued to advance, and the cave began to change. The walls, once flat and smooth, began to be covered with strange marks and drawings, symbols that seemed to move with the passage of the explorers. The sound of his footsteps became heavier and heavier, as if the cave itself was absorbing his energy. Suddenly, Isabel screamed, her pale face lit by the light of the flashlight. "Look at this," he said, pointing to one of the walls. On the rock, the markings seemed to have come to life, forming figures that shouldn't be there. Twisted shadows of creatures that have never been seen before, or at least not in this world. The scout's eyes widened. The atmosphere had become dense, unbreathable, as if the place were becoming aware of its presence. But the worst was yet to come. As they went farther in, the air became even heavier, permeated with palpable fear. Suddenly, the ground began to shake. A rumbling sound, deep and distant, could be heard through the walls, as if something gigantic was waking up from a long sleep. The cave was not simply a geological formation. It was something much darker, something alive, something that should not be disturbed. The tremor intensified, and murmurs began to be heard from all directions. Like distant whispers, fragments of words that they could not understand, but that caused a deep shudder in their bones. "We have to get out of here," Jorge said, his voice agitated with panic. But when they tried to turn back, they realized that the road they had come by was no longer there. The cave seemed to have changed. The corridors were no longer the same, and the markings on the walls now glowed with a reddish light, as if they were pulsating with a life of their own. A figure appeared in front of them, standing in the hallway. She was tall, dressed in a dark cloak that seemed to float in the air. His face was covered by a mask, but his eyes shone with an unearthly intensity, filled with an unfathomable emptiness. The figure stretched out a hand towards them, pointing at them, and in that instant, a wave of terror invaded their hearts. The scouts tried to run, but the figure surrounded them. The air began to become dense, heavy, as if it were almost impossible to breathe. "What do you want from us?" shouted Marta. But the figure did not respond. Suddenly, a gust of icy wind enveloped them, and the cave seemed to open into a gigantic crevice, swallowing them in the darkness. Luis was the first to wake up, alone, in the back of a huge chamber with the others missing. The cave was now completely silent with no signs of life. But as he got up and began to walk, he realized that the ground was covered with bones, remnants of what had been before him. And worst of all, when he looked back, he saw the figure closer than ever advancing towards him. His scream was drowned out by the noise of the cave, and all that remained was its echo. The cave of oblivion had claimed his soul. No one would get out of there alive. Horror, terror, and panic hung over them like an endless nightmare, and the cave was sealed once more, awaiting its next victim. Night hung over the house with an eerie stillness, silence only interrupted by the occasional sound of a branch hitting the window. Laura was in her living room, embraced by the gloom that filtered through the curtains. The dim light of the table lamp dimly illuminated the book in his hands. In those moments of loneliness, I always found solace in the pages of a good novel, an escape from the daily grind. Tonight, however, something seemed different, something in the air that he couldn't clearly identify. The wall clock struck 9, and Laura heard a noise that broke the tranquility. A soft knock, as if someone were knocking on the door. He got up from the couch and walked toward the entrance, a slight feeling of discomfort running down his back. I never expected visitors at that time. He looked out the window before opening the door, but saw no one. A shiver ran through his body, though he tried to ignore it. After all, it could be children playing or someone in the wrong house. He opened the door, and there he was, a man standing in his doorway. He had a serious appearance, with a dark jacket and a hat that partially covered his face. Laura stared at him, bewildered. She didn't recognize him, but there was something in his eyes that seemed strangely familiar. "Good evening," the man said in a deep but calm voice. "Laura, right?" Laura frowned, overwhelmed by a growing sense of unease. "Yes, but I don't know you. How do you know my name?" The man smiled slightly, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "I told you, Laura. We know each other, even if you don't remember it." Laura blinked, confused. What was he talking about? She had never seen that man in her life. How could I meet her? The air in the room seemed to have become dense, as if the atmosphere itself was being charged with something indescribable. "I'm sorry, but I can't help you," Laura said, trying to remain calm as she took a step back. "I don't know you." The man stood there, motionless, watching her with an uncomfortable intensity. Without saying a word, his eyes flashed for a moment with a strange light. Laura, feeling the weight of the situation, tried to close the door. But before he could, the man stepped forward, preventing him from doing so. "You don't need to be nervous," she said with an eerie calm. "I just want to talk. It's important." Laura's heart began to pound. She didn't understand what was happening, but something inside her was telling her to be alert. The feeling of being watched intensified, and the house, which had once been her refuge, suddenly seemed like a strange alien place. "What do you want?" he asked in a thin voice, trying to stay in control. The man stared at her before answering. "Come with me. There are things you need to remember." A shiver ran down Laura's spine. What things should I remember? The feeling of fear invaded her completely, but at the same time she couldn't help but feel intrigued. Something about the way the man spoke made her feel like she couldn't just refuse him. "I'm going to call the police if you don't leave," he finally said, unable to hide the anxiety in his voice. But the man didn't seem to flinch at the threat. "You can do it if you prefer," he replied with unsettling calmness, "but it won't change anything." Laura felt a growing pressure in her chest. The need to understand what was happening prompted her to take a step back, reluctantly allowing her into her home. The man walked into the room with terrifying naturalness, as if he had been there thousands of times before. "I shouldn't have," Laura muttered to herself, though she knew it was too late. The door closed with a dull sound, and the house was filled with an ominous calm, as if time itself had stopped. The air seemed denser, and the darkness thicker. She sat down on the couch, unable to take her eyes off the man. He sat down in front of her, his arms folded, staring at her. "What I want you to remember is that," he finally said. "Remember what you forgot." Laura frowned, completely bewildered. "I don't understand what you're talking about. I don't know you. Who are you?" The man stared at her, and for an instant, Laura saw something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. It was as if there was a connection between them. something deep and ancient that I couldn't comprehend. The feeling of dread grew inside him. "I am someone from your past," he replied, his voice deeper. "Someone who knows you better than you think, and something you forgot comes looking for you." Laura didn't understand what was happening, but the man's words echoed in her mind. Something in his tone, in his gaze, caused a feeling of deep terror to take hold of her. A primitive fear, as if something that had been hidden for a long time was about to be revealed. "Leave me alone," he said, rising quickly from the couch. But when she turned to the door, a piercing cry stopped her. "You can't run away from who you are." The scream echoed throughout the house, and at that moment Laura felt as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. He looked at the man in horror, feeling the air grow even denser, as if his own breath was getting heavier and heavier. "What do you want from me?" he murmured, his voice trembling, unable to comprehend what was happening. The man slowly got up, approaching her unhurriedly, as if he knew there was no escape. "What I want you to remember is that you remember everything you have forgotten." Laura backed away, but the shadows of the house seemed to envelop her, barring any attempt to flee. His heart was pounding, and a cold sweat ran down his forehead. The man looked at her with that same frightful calmness, and at that moment, she understood something that made her blood run cold. She was no longer alone. When Javier walked into the antique store on a cold winter afternoon, he didn't know his life would never be the same. The air was thick, full of dust and the unmistakable smell of old wood. The store, located in a forgotten corner of the city, seemed like a refuge for everything that had been left behind, for those objects that time had marked, but that still had something of value inside. Every corner was crammed with strange artifacts, broken clocks, opaque mirrors, unusually shaped furniture, and portraits of expressionless faces that seemed to observe the visitor with an eerie calm. Javier had been attracted to the store by a strange sensation, something inexplicable that had pushed him to enter. The owner, an elderly man, sat behind a counter full of more items for sale, his eyes hidden behind thick glasses. He didn't pay much attention to it at first, as his gaze was fixed on an object he couldn't stop staring at. A portrait. The painting was hung on one of the back walls. An ancient portrait of a man with a serious face, but with a penetrating gaze that seemed to follow him even from a distance. The man painted in the picture wore a white linen shirt and a dark hat, and his countenance, though calm, conveyed a sense of uneasiness that could not be ignored. The eyes, dark and deep, stood out with a peculiar intensity. Javier felt a chill run down his spine as he watched them. The shop owner looked at him over his glasses and, in a raspy voice, told him that the painting had belonged to a man with a dark history, a history that the townspeople preferred to forget. He said that no one in his right mind should buy it, but Javier, although bewildered by the old man's words, felt that something inside him was impelling him to take it. Maybe it was the feeling of being able to own something so unique, something with so much history. The old man, seeing that Javier was not going to change his mind, gave him the price, and finally the man took it. When he returned home, Javier hung the portrait on the wall of his living room, right in front of the sofa where he used to spend his nights watching television. At first everything seemed normal, although I couldn't help but feel a strange discomfort every time I looked at the painting. The eyes of the man in the portrait looked like move, but it couldn't be. I was sure I was imagining things. However, that feeling of discomfort grew with each passing day. One night, after a long day at work, Javier sat on his sofa, tired, and saw the portrait once more. This time the feeling was different. The eyes of the man in the painting not only followed him, but stalked him. No matter where he moved in the room, those eyes stared at him. A chill ran through his body as a cold sweat pooled on his forehead. He blinked several times, trying to get the idea out of his head. It couldn't be real. How could it? It was just a painting. But as the night wore on, the presence of those eyes made him feel more and more trapped. As the days went by, Javier began to see things that he could not explain. Sometimes, when he looked at the portrait, the man's eyes seemed to move slightly, as if they were fixed on him. Other times I felt something in the room change, as if the air was charged with a palpable tension. The shadows seemed to be longer than usual, and the noises in the house were intensifying. Creaking walls, barely audible whispers. He woke up in the middle of the night with the feeling that someone was watching him, and when he opened his eyes, all he saw was darkness. But he couldn't shake the feeling that those eyes were stalking him even in his dreams. The situation worsened when, one night, Javier decided to move the portrait to another wall, in an attempt to free himself from the growing sense of anxiety. However, in doing this, something strange happened. As he lifted the painting, a feeling of extreme cold came over him and a dark shadow seemed to cover the place. The eyes of the man in the portrait were staring at him, more intense than ever. At that moment, something changed in the atmosphere of the house. Javier felt an indescribable panic, as if the air itself was pressing on him, as if something invisible was imprisoning him. He couldn't take it anymore and left the portrait on the floor, determined to get rid of it the next day. But that night was the worst of all. Javier woke up with a stabbing pain in his chest, as if someone was pressing his heart. He sat up in bed, looking around, and it was then that he saw something he would never forget. The man in the portrait was standing on the threshold of his room door. His figure was dull, blurred, but his eyes were still the same, those eyes that had haunted him since day one. It was not a dream. It couldn't be. Javier tried to scream, but his voice did not come out. Terror paralyzed him. The man in the portrait began to walk towards him, and with each step, the ground creaked under his weight. Javier tried to move, to get up, but his body did not respond. He was trapped, completely at the mercy of that evil presence that was advancing towards him. The man's eyes shone with a terrifying intensity, as if they had taken on a life of their own, as if they were devouring his soul. At that moment, Javier understood that the portrait was not just a painting. It was a prison, and he was the victim. Suddenly, an invisible force lifted him from the ground and dragged him towards the portrait. He tried to fight, but his strength was fading. The man in the painting watched him unhurriedly while Javier fell to his knees in front of him. At that moment, the air became heavy, almost unbearable, and everything around him began to crumble. The ground beneath his feet disintegrated and the walls faded into darkness. Javier was being absorbed by the painting. In a last-ditch attempt to escape, he managed to turn and see the portrait before being completely consumed. The man in the portrait was looking at him with a satisfied expression, as if he had served his purpose. At that moment, Javier understood that he had been chosen. The portrait had not only stalked him, but had claimed him. The house fell silent. The portrait continued to hang on the wall as if nothing had changed. Nobody knew what had happened to Javier. No one knew that, in that painting, there was now a new look, a new pair of eyes that would follow anyone who dared to observe it, catching the next victim just as it had done with him. The cursed portrait was still waiting in silence, ready to claim whatever was necessary to satisfy his eternal hunger. In a remote place where time seemed to have stopped and the wind whispered forgotten secrets, a small village lay hidden among the mountains, almost beyond the reach of man. In the distance, the mountains rose as guardians of a past that had been erased from the memories of the world. Stone houses, old and crumbling, lined the cobblestone streets. But there was no sign of life. No one lived there. The heavy air of humidity and silence enveloped the town, as if the environment itself had decided to forget its existence. The few broken windows seemed to watch those who dared to approach, their shards of glass reflecting a distorted image of the outside world, as if the place refused to be part of reality. A group of 5 travelers, tired from their long journey, arrived on the outskirts of the town. In their search for a refuge where they could rest, they were attracted by the stillness that emanated from the village, believing that perhaps there they could find relief from the exhausting road that had led them there. With backpacks slung over their shoulders and faces scarred by the sun and fatigue, they entered without hesitation, ignoring the strange premonition that was beginning to form in their hearts. It was a gray afternoon, the sky covered by dense clouds that gave a glimpse of a dim light. Despite the calm of the place, something in the air was strange, oppressive, as if the very shadows of the houses were waiting for something or someone. As travelers moved through the deserted streets, the doors of the houses were kept closed, the blinds lowered, and the typical noises of a moving people could not be heard. The feeling of emptiness was so palpable that they could almost hear the echo of their own footsteps echoing on the pavement. Suddenly, one of them, Gabriel, looked up, feeling an unsettling pressure in his chest. At the top of one of the houses, through a dirty window, he could see a blurred figure leaning out to watch them. He couldn't make out their details, but just knowing that someone or something was watching them caused a stream of cold to run down his spine. "Have you seen that?" Gabriel said quietly, still looking out the window. The group looked at him, confused, but no one could confirm what he had seen. The figure disappeared before anyone could approach or say anything. However, that strange feeling of being watched settled in the air, as if the buildings themselves and the wind whispered ancient secrets that did not want to be revealed. As they explored the village, they realized that everything was in ruins. Streets that might once have been lively and bustling were covered in brush and debris. The houses, though empty, did not appear to have been abandoned recently. There were traces of a life that once flourished there, but it had all been trapped in time. The doors were still locked with old rusty locks, and the broken windows let out drafts of icy air. The people seemed to be stuck in a perpetual present, as if an invisible force had frozen life right there at that precise moment. "This place is not right," murmured Marta, one of the travelers, as she looked at the shadows that stretched along the walls of the houses, as if something or someone was watching them. "Don't you find it strange that it's so desert?" The group continued to move forward, and as they did so, the feeling that they were not alone intensified. As they walked down the main street, each of them felt the air pressure become denser, heavier, as if the place was slowly absorbing their energy. It was then that a sound, slight but disturbing, reached his ears. The creak of a wooden door opening. The sound came from one of the houses on the left. No one dared to move immediately. A shudder ran through their bodies, and for a moment they all looked at each other silently, wondering if the sound was real or just a hallucination created by the strange atmosphere around them. "Does anyone dare to enter?" asked Tomas, the bravest of the group, although his voice sounded more fearful than he intended. No one answered. The door opened even wider, as if an invisible force was pushing it. The pressure in the air was unbearable, and each of them knew that something was not right, but none dared to turn around. With a mixture of curiosity and fear, Marta was the first to approach the door. His steps were slow, measured, as if he were walking into the unknown, a place where the rules of the real world no longer applied. When she crossed the threshold of the house, a gust of icy air enveloped her, as if the very darkness of the place was consuming her. The interior of the house was gloomy, with furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. The walls, decorated with old landscape paintings that may once have been beautiful, now showed only distorted faces, as if the portraits in the painting reflected the tragedy of the place. A shiver ran through his body. I couldn't understand how a place so far from everything could have such dense energy, that feeling of death suspended in the air. "This is not right," Martha murmured, looking back at the door, where the others were watching her from the doorway. But before she could take a step back, she heard a whisper behind her. A whisper so low it seemed to come from the ground, a distorted, distant voice that barely reached his ears. "Come out. Go away." Her heart racing, Martha turned around. But before she could leave the house, the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. The group outside shuddered, hearing the loud sound of the door closing, and they ran towards it. But when they arrived, they found something even more terrifying. The door was sealed as if it had never existed. No one could enter or leave. Desperate, they began to look for a way to free her, but what they found inside the house left them frozen. The walls were covered with strange engraved symbols, symbols that seemed to move slowly as if they were alive. The atmosphere was dense, oppressive. The objects in the room were shaking, as if an invisible force was trying to harm them. Suddenly Martha appeared at the window, her face pale and disfigured with terror. She tried to speak, but her mouth only uttered unintelligible words. The travelers tried to shout at him, but their voices were lost in the air. As time went on, anxiety took hold of everyone. Despite their despair, something in the back of their minds told them that they must not leave the village without solving the mystery, that something dark lurked in the shadows of those forgotten ruins. No one could escape, but no one knew how to stop the nightmare. The shadows seemed to grow, lengthening as night fell. The people were alive, but not with the life they knew. He fed on fear, on the dread that was beginning to settle in their hearts. As the hours progressed, the figures began to appear again in the broken windows, staring at them with empty eyes, the eyes of those they never forgot. Each of the travelers began to hear whispers in their ears, soft but disturbing voices telling them different things. Some asked them to stay, that the people needed them. Others ordered them to flee before it was too late. The walls, the ceilings, the windows, everything seemed to come to life, changing, twisting, and every corner of the house seemed to want to devour them. Panic turned to pure terror when, without warning, a figure materialized in front of them. A woman with a pale face and eyes as dark as the night. His presence was so overwhelming that everything around him disappeared, and all that remained was his haunting figure, floating in the air. "They stay with us. Everyone must stay," the woman said in a raspy voice. A shriek broke the air as one of the travelers attempted to flee, but the door, once open, slammed shut again, sealing everyone's fate. As darkness enveloped them completely, they understood the cruel truth. The forgotten people would no longer let them go. They were part of their history, part of their eternal cycle of terror, doomed to be watched, and ultimately forgotten by all but those who dared to enter. In the end, all that remained were the shadows. The icy wind was blowing against the windows of the train. The darkness was absolute, like a blanket that covered the vastness of the landscape. No one was on board except her. A woman with a pale face and restless eyes, sitting on an empty seat, was looking out the window, looking for something in the nothingness that could give her an answer. Her name was Clara, and she had taken the train for reasons she could hardly remember. A call in the early morning, an urgent warning that had dragged her on this endless journey. It didn't matter that it was late or that the train was so strange. His destiny seemed unshakable. The train moved forward without stopping, through a desolate and gloomy landscape. The trees seemed to die in their wake, their shadows spreading like specters crawling over the frozen ground. The only light was the dim light that came from the train lamps, creating more shadows than light. Clara couldn't take her eyes off the window. Sometimes I thought I saw figures moving in the dark, but when I looked again, nothing was there. She thought that maybe fatigue was starting to get to her, that the endless hours on the train were confusing her. The sound of the train was constant, like a dull murmur, accompanied by the creaking of the rails that seemed to intensify as time passed. Across the aisle, Clara observed the closed doors of the carriages. Something in the air had changed, but he didn't know what. The feeling of being watched took hold of her. He got up from his seat with effort, his legs trembling from the lack of movement. He slowly walked down the hallway, his breathing getting heavier as he neared the end of the train. When she reached the last door, she tried to open it, but something stopped her. A cold, inexplicable hand rested on his shoulder. Clara turned quickly, her heart leaping from her chest, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. However, the feeling of being accompanied by something or someone was still present, persistent and overwhelming. With a trembling sigh, he opened the door of the last carriage. The scene that unfolded before her was completely different from what she had seen in the previous carriages. Instead of empty seats and metal walls, the atmosphere became thick, as if the air was charged with dense energy. The carriage looked older, the timbers worn, the walls covered in mold. The train was no longer moving, but it was not stopping either. It was suspended in time. A shiver ran down his spine. Clara stepped back, and at that moment she heard a faint sound like a whisper coming from the shadows. Something was calling to her, something she couldn't see but felt deeply. Cautiously, he walked toward the center of the carriage, his footsteps echoing strangely, as if the sound were muffled by the invisible mist that filled the air. Suddenly the voice appeared. It was not a human voice, but a distant muffled whisper, as if someone were speaking from the bottom of an abyss. "Don't go," the voice whispered. "You can't leave." Clara took a step back, her body stiff with fear. The whisper seemed to envelop her, filling every corner of her mind. Faces began to materialize around him, ethereal figures emerging from the shadows. Some of them looked human, but their empty eyes and disfigured faces made it clear that they weren't. Others were just shadowy silhouettes without a defined form, but with a presence so overwhelming that the air itself became dense and heavy. What is this?" murmured Clara, trying to find her voice in the midst of the chaos. The atmosphere was getting thicker and thicker, as if something invisible was pressing on it, crushing it. The figures began to move, gliding towards her with terrifying slowness. "We can't rest," said one figure, his voice hoarse and broken. "The train never stops for us. We're trapped just like you." Clara tried to take a step back, but her feet did not respond. She felt as if the ground was swallowing her shoes, as if every movement was a struggle against an invisible force that held her prisoner. The figures around him whispered, repeating words he couldn't understand. And then a different voice, clearer and full of despair, spun her quickly. "Help me!" shouted an approaching figure. Clara could make out the features of a woman, her face contorted with pain and anguish. "Don't leave me here. Don't go, please." But before Clara could answer, the woman disappeared, vanishing like a mist. The air became even colder, and the presence of the spirits began to surround her, getting closer and closer. Clara felt the weight of his gaze, the weight of his untold stories. The train was still not moving, but time no longer seemed to exist. Nothing moved outside the car, just a perpetual void that stretched into nothingness. At that moment, Clara realized the worst. She was also a prisoner. The train never stopped, never got anywhere. She was also trapped in that suspended space between the past and the future, between life and death. The voices intensified, the whisper of trapped souls surrounded her. "Why don't you leave?" A shadow murmured in front of her. "We couldn't, but you can still get out." But Clara didn't know if there was still anything left out. She didn't know if there was anything beyond the train, beyond the station where she was now trapped. Was she dead? Was she alive? The faces of the dead watched her, waiting for an answer that she herself did not have. Fear invaded her, terror began to consume her, but something inside her told her that there was a way out, a way to escape. "Let me out," shouted Clara, her voice cracking with panic. "Let me go." The shadows came closer, touching his skin with cold hands. "You can't leave," they said in unison. "The train never ends. Time does not advance for us, but there's something you can do." Clara looked at them, her eyes full of tears, her heart pounding. "What do I have to do?" he asked in a trembling voice. One of the figures, that of the desperate woman, approached her. "You have to decide. Stay and be one of us, or move on and break the cycle. But you'll never be free without making that choice." The sound of the train began to change. It was no longer the constant rumbling of the rails. Now there was a soft sound, like the rustling of fallen leaves. The station seemed to crumble around her as if the walls of the train were beginning to fade. "Choose quickly," said another shadow, his voice broken and anguished. "The train is stopping. You'll never have this opportunity again." Clara, her heart racing, looked around. Shadows clustered around her, reaching out their hands toward her soul. Time seemed to dilate and compress at the same time. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't stay there. He couldn't become one of them. I needed to get out. Suddenly, the train stopped. A deep silence invaded the space. The darkness around him slowly dissolved, and Clara found herself back at the station, the fresh air beating down on her face. She was no longer alone. The shadows, the ghosts had vanished, and the station had ceased to exist. The train had come to an end, but Clara had also left the last station behind. She wasn't trapped, and though terror had been his companion all this time, he now understood that he had chosen freedom. No matter what came next, she had decided to continue, and with that decision, the train and the fear disappeared forever. The sun was beginning to set, bathing the trees of the forest in a golden light that promised a quiet night. A group of friends had ventured into the heart of the evergreen woods to enjoy a weekend of camping. 4 young people, inseparable since childhood, had decided to disconnect from the demands of daily life and immerse themselves in nature, seeking to escape from the routine. A campfire crackled in the center of his makeshift camp, surrounded by the dark shadows cast on the ground by the treetops. Laughter echoed through the tree trunks, but something beyond laughter and stories began to spread through the air. It wasn't a palpable sound or a clear omen, but friends were beginning to feel it. Like an invisible presence watching them lurking from the thicket, Lena, the most outgoing of the group, had decided to explore the terrain a bit while the others pitched their tents. He walked aimlessly, his flashlight illuminating only the immediate surroundings. Soon he found himself in a clearing where the trees opened up, revealing an empty space in which the wind blew with unusual force. It was there that he saw it. A child standing in the middle of the clearing, staring at her. Lena stopped, surprised. The boy didn't look more than 10 years old, his clothes dirty and frayed, as if he'd been wandering in the woods for weeks. "Hello?" Lena asked in a soft voice, although her instinct told her that something was not right. The boy did not respond. He didn't move even a little. Lena felt a strange discomfort, but she forced a smile and took a step towards him. The boy didn't seem to be afraid of the light of his flashlight or its presence. In fact, his gaze was fixed on Lena, as if he was waiting for something, as if he had been waiting for someone. "What are you doing here alone?" Lena asked, not knowing why, but feeling like she had to ask. The boy just moved his head back and forth slowly. Lena felt the air become denser, as if something was oppressing her. His breathing quickened as he stared at the boy's eyes, which seemed too empty to be from such a young child. "You should go back to your friends," Lena murmured, feeling the discomfort take over her body. At that moment, the boy began to slowly walk towards her. Lena, caught between the desire to help him and the growing fear that gripped her, took a few steps back. His flashlight flashed with every step the boy took, and before he could react, the boy disappeared into the trees, as if he had never been there. Lena stood still, her mind struggling to comprehend what she had just seen. He ran back to camp. When he arrived, he found his friends sitting around the campfire, apparently calm, but something in the air, something in their eyes had changed. "Everything is fine?" Mark asked him, the most serious of the group. "I saw a child in the woods," Lena said, her voice trembling. "He was alone. He seemed lost. But something wasn't right. I don't know how to explain it." "A child?" Ethan said, arching an eyebrow. "Are you sure what you saw?" Lena nodded, but her words didn't seem to fully convince her friends. However, the concern on their faces indicated that the idea that something strange was happening was already in their heads. They decided that it would be best to stay close to the camp and not go further into the forest that night. The hours passed slowly, and darkness took over the place. The sound of the wind moving the leaves of the trees created an unsettling sound, while the campfire continued to burn weakly. But it was when the clock struck midnight that terror began to grow among them. A loud bang, as if something heavy had fallen nearby, made everyone rise with a start. The light of the campfire trembled as the wind seemed to increase in intensity. Everyone looked silently at the edge of the camp, where the darkness seemed even thicker than before. Something was not right. "Did you hear that?" Andrea whispered, her face pale. There was no response, only the sound of their breaths. Fear took hold of each one as they looked around, looking for a rational explanation for what they had just heard. It was then that the child appeared again. This time he was not alone. Beside him, a taller, more somber figure stood tall like a shadow above him. The boy was walking, but the figure behind him seemed to move at his own pace, moving unhurriedly, but without stopping. The friends froze, watching silently as the boy slowly approached, as if he was walking towards them. "Don't move," Ethan whispered, grabbing Lena's arm. But it was too late. The boy had reached the edge of the campfire. His face, pale and gloomy, was now clearer, and the emptiness in his eyes seemed to engulf all the light around him. "Go away!" Mark shouted, but the boy did not move. Suddenly, the figure behind the boy completely materialized. She was not human. His body was a mass of shadows, his red eyes glowing with terrifying intensity, and his presence seemed to absorb all the light around him. The darkness around her stretched out as if she were alive, enveloping everything in its path. Who are you?" Andrea asked, her words coming out with difficulty. The figure did not answer. The boy took a step forward, and immediately the shadow followed. The friends got up and began to retreat, but shadows seemed to take over everything around them. The air had become heavy, unbreathable, as if an invisible weight were crushing them. That's when it all fell apart. The boy raised his hand, pointing towards them. The ground trembled, and a dark shadow emerged from the ground, enveloping everyone's legs. Screams filled the air, but the sound seemed to drown out nothingness. Lena tried to move her legs, but the darkness held her tight. The boy smiled, an empty smile, devoid of emotion. His eyes shone with an unearthly glow. "You can't escape," he whispered, his voice a low echo. Suddenly, the shadow around them began to twist, as if it had a life of its own, and the friends felt the pressure mounting. Fear paralyzed them. The darkness seemed to swallow them little by little. The boy began to disappear, merging into the shadow, as the figure behind him faded like a whisper into nothingness. The friends, trapped in the darkness, felt the piercing cold around them. They couldn't move, they couldn't breathe, trapped in an endless nightmare. The last vision they had was of the boy, slowly fading into the shadows, his laughter echoing in their minds, an echo that would never fade. It had been a long journey on lonely roads, in a place forgotten by time and the passage of men. The traveler, tired and exhausted, had not seen any sign of life for miles. The road was like an endless river of asphalt, flanked by trees that stretched out to the horizon, as if they wanted to devour it. The sunlight was beginning to fade, dyeing the sky a warm, ominous red. He thought about stopping at any hostel, but in his desperation he barely saw a small sign indicating the existence of a hotel. "Forgotten Hotel," read the faded paint on the sign. It seemed perfect for an overnight stay, a refuge, a break from the endless road. When he arrived, the place seemed much older than he had expected. The walls of the hotel, covered in moss and mold, gave the impression that the place had been forgotten by the whole world. The building was large, two-story, with broken windows and doors that creaked as they moved. However, something about the place attracted him, and fatigue pushed him to enter. The door opened with a frightful creak, but on the other side there was nothing but darkness. He hesitated for a moment, but then the need for rest overcame logic. He pushed open the door, which slowly gave way, revealing the hall. The front desk was dark, with only a dim light flickering over the counter. A strange-looking man with an aged face and an expressionless gaze was sitting behind the counter. He didn't say anything, just looked up and gave him a room key. The traveler accepted it with an uncomfortable feeling in his stomach. The atmosphere was strange, as if time did not exist within the walls of the hotel. He climbed the stairs, feeling the weight of the stairs creak beneath his feet. When he reached the hallway, he realized that the walls were covered with old photographs, but not the typical family photographs. No, they showed strange and distorted faces, people with empty eyes and disconcerting expressions. Somehow, those images seemed familiar, as if they were staring at him. However, he kept going, ignoring a sensation that he couldn't shake. The room was small, with an aged-looking wooden bed and a window that looked out onto a desolate landscape, as if the world were just an endless expanse of gray land. The lamp flickered, and when he turned off the light, the room was plunged into deep darkness. But something wasn't right. There was a smell of humidity and something else in the air. Something he couldn't identify, something that made him uncomfortable. He went to bed, but he couldn't sleep. Shadows seemed to move around the room, slipping through cracks in the walls and ceiling. He got up, and as he approached the window, he looked more closely at the outside. There was no movement in the landscape, but something in the distance caught his attention. A figure standing in the middle of the field, motionless, looking towards the hotel. The figure looked human, but its posture was strange, as if it was unnatural. The traveler looked away, feeling a twinge in his chest, but when he looked again, the figure had disappeared. Restlessness began to take hold of him, and he decided to leave the room. He returned to the corridor, where the old portrait seemed to look at him with more intensity. Upon arriving at the lobby, he noticed that the man at the front desk was no longer there. Instead, a door was ajar, and on the other side, a light flickered faintly. Intrigued, he walked over and pushed her cautiously. What he saw took his breath away. In the room was a wooden table covered with dust, and on it an old photo album. He approached and opened it. The photos were from previous hotel guests, but something was wrong. The people in the photos did not have full faces. Their eyes were hollow, empty, and their smiles distorted. On the last page, one photo in particular made his blood run cold. It was him. He was in the picture, even though he had never been there before. The image showed his face with empty eyes and a macabre smile that froze his soul. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet began to creak, and a deafening sound, like a murmur of whispering voices, filled the air. The walls began to shake, and the traveler felt as if the shadows in the corridor surrounded him. In horror, he noticed that the figures in the photos seemed to come to life, their empty eyes fixed on him as their lips formed mute words. Suddenly, one of the figures detached from the photo and dissolved into a dark fog that began to envelop him. Fear invaded him completely. He ran to the door, but before he could reach it, the figure in the photograph appeared before him, now a grim specter, with a sinister smile that seemed to mock his despair. The figure stretched out its hand towards him, and the traveler, unable to move, felt as if the air were escaping from his lungs. Every corner of the hotel was filled with voices whispering dark secrets about everyone who had been there before him. The hotel's former guests, those who had disappeared without a trace, were now part of an eternal curse. The traveler, in his attempt to escape, ran to the exit, but in the hall he saw the walls crumble, photographs falling from the walls, and figures in the photos sliding toward him closer and closer. He tried to open the door, but it was sealed, trapped inside the hotel. In a last-ditch attempt to find a way out, he stepped into the darkness of the hallway, but the sound of whispering voices surrounded him completely. All he could hear was a distant echo, one last warning. No one leaves this hotel. The hotel, that crumbling construction that seemed to be on the edge of nowhere, swallowed the traveler, and his soul was trapped next to the former guests, condemned to repeat their agony over and over again. The shadows of the hotel continued to lurk, awaiting the arrival of another lone traveler who would fall into its trap, unable to escape the horrors that lurked within its walls. Each night, the city fell into a deep, dark silence, as if time itself stood still. The moonlight barely made it through the heavy clouds that crept across the sky. It was an oppressive stillness, interrupted only by the sudden roar of the storm that began promptly at midnight. No one in the city knew where it came from, but everyone knew its destructive power. Every time he started, the city trembled as if it was under the control of a force beyond his comprehension. The storm brought with it not only the torrential rain and the fierce wind, but something much more terrifying. When thunder echoed in the sky, so did whispers. Whispers that seemed to come from the shadows, floating through the trees, sneaking through the windows, whispering things that only you knew. Secrets, fears, forgotten desires. Everything you had tried to hide over the years was revealed in those dark moments, as if the storm was drawn from your worst nightmares. The first to notice the storm were the most vulnerable, children. They woke up in the middle of the night, sweaty and scared, with the echo of strange voices floating in their heads. Many said that the storm spoke to them, that they saw dark figures moving through the rain. The shadows that emerged from the drop seemed more human than spectral. Some even swore that the figures stared at them from the other side of the windows, their eyes as empty as the abyss itself. As the storm raged, its effects spread beyond the minds of children. No one was safe. Adults were beginning to lose their sanity. The city, which once seemed to be at peace, was transformed into a place full of murmurs and disturbing whispers. The empty streets were not enough to avoid the feeling of being followed, of being observed. No one could sleep, but no one dared to talk about what was happening. The terror was so deep that even the words felt dangerous, as if talking about the storm brought with it an even worse curse. Of all the people affected, the one who was most affected by the storm was Clara, a young woman who had lived in the city all her life. Clara was strong, skeptical, and had always thought that fear was just a construct of the human mind. But one night, as the clock struck 12 and the storm began to break out, Clara felt for the first time a chill run down her spine. She was alone in her house. The sound of rain beating against the windows was all she could hear, but then the whisper came. First, a faint, barely audible murmur, as if someone were in the same room as her. Clara looked around, but the house was empty. There was nothing and no one. However, the whisper persisted. It slipped into his ears, whispering something he couldn't understand. Each time I tried to block out the sound, it got louder. "Clara," murmured the voice, this time clearer. His own name, whispered by someone he couldn't see. Panic began to grow inside her. Her breathing became erratic and her heart was pounding. He looked out the window, looking for any signs that might make sense of what he felt. But there was nothing, only darkness and rain. Still, I knew something else was going on. Something dark. Something that had been haunting the city for years, and now it had reached it. The storm brought not only rain and wind, but something far worse. An ancient force that had been patiently waiting for the right moment to manifest. Over the next few weeks, the storm continued to batter the city each night, bringing with it more mysterious figures. Some of them seemed to be people Clara knew, but their behavior was strange and erratic. Sometimes the figures appeared in the streets, other times in her dreams, always empty-eyed and smiles twisted, staring at her, waiting for her to recognize them. The shadows lengthened and the voices multiplied. Clara no longer knew if she was awake or dreaming, if the storm was really there or if her mind was falling apart. Panic soon took over the city. People began fleeing their homes, seeking shelter in places far from the storm. But wherever they went, the storm followed them. No one was safe. The streets were filled with shadows, with figures that seemed to belong to another world. But the worst thing was that those figures were not strangers. The voices whispering in the darkness were of acquaintances, of loved ones, of those who had once stood by them and who were now nothing more than echoes of a past life. Desperation took hold of the city's inhabitants, but there was no escape. There was no end to the storm, and its effects were becoming more and more terrifying. Houses began to collapse, lights suddenly went out, and dark figures became more aggressive. Some tried to resist, clinging to the hope that it would all end at dawn. But that hope was quickly extinguished. Clara, now on the verge of madness, decided to face the storm once and for all. She knew that something in her was calling her, that the storm was not a simple weather manifestation. It was something much deeper, something that had been waiting for someone to confront it. The only way to end all that, Clara thought, was to face the darkness itself. So on a moonless night, he plucked up the courage and took to the streets of the city. The rain was pounding furiously and the wind seemed to rip everything in its path. But Clara did not hesitate. She advanced through the deserted streets, guided only by the echo of her own fear. That's when she saw it. In the center of the city, where the shadows seemed denser, a figure emerged from the darkness. A tall figure wrapped in a black cloak that floated around him as if the air itself feared him. Clara didn't know if she was seeing a person or an entity, but something inside her knew that figure was the key. The figure slowly approached, and as it did, the voices grew louder. "Clara, come," whispered the shadows, getting closer and closer. "Come and know your destiny." The figure stopped in front of Clara, and at that moment his face appeared. It wasn't human, but it wasn't something Clara could understand either. It was a face formed by darkness itself, a mask that was constantly changing, absorbing everything it touched. "We've been waiting for you," the figure said in a tone that echoed in his mind. "The storm is just the beginning. Your soul is scarred, Clara. And now, at last, you will be a part of this eternal place. Come to us." Clara, with terror taking over her body, took a step back. Shadows surrounded her, and mysterious figures began to emerge from all sides. Murmurs filled the air, and the figure in front of her stretched out a hand towards her. I knew I couldn't escape. Panic paralyzed her, and in that instant she realized that the storm was not a natural force, but something far more sinister. She had been summoned by something dark, and no matter how strong her will was, it was too late. The city, the storm, the shadows, all came together in one point, and Clara faded into the darkness, becoming one of the figures who roamed the streets every night, trapped in an eternal cycle of terror. The midnight storm never stopped. In the depths of an ancient monastery, surrounded by impenetrable jungle, stood a forgotten reliquary, jealously guarded for centuries by a community of monks. No one knew of its existence except for a select few who, for generations, were in charge of protecting the object that was said to possess supernatural powers. Legend claimed that the reliquary was a container of curse, which had been sealed with spells so dark that anyone who dared to open it would fall into eternal damnation. Over the centuries, many had tried to find it, but none returned, and the monastery fell into oblivion. Today, a renowned archaeologist named Gabriel Vazquez, obsessed with unraveling the secrets of antiquity, arrived at the monastery. He had heard rumors about the reliquary, and the idea that its existence might be linked to humanity's ancient rituals and dark powers drew him in with irresistible force. Despite the warnings of his colleagues who told him about the disappearances of those who had searched for the reliquary, Gabriel decided to undertake the search. His greed to uncover the truth blinded him to danger, and he resolutely ventured deep into the jungle. As he went, the warning signs became clearer. Ruins that had never been documented appeared before his eyes, covered in strange symbols that seemed to move in the gloom, whispering unintelligible words. Gabriel felt a growing sense of anxiety, but his curiosity kept him steadfast. He had come too far to give up now. When he finally arrived at the monastery, he found the building in ruins, covered in weeds, but its structure still stood, almost defiant in the face of the passage of time. Inside, the shadows seemed to take on a life of their own, and a heavy air of desolation permeated every corner. The monks who had cared for him for centuries were gone, but something remained, something sinister. Gabriel could feel it, a tug in his chest, as if a presence was watching him, waiting. He went into the heart of the monastery, an ancient room that seemed untouched by man in centuries. In the center of the room, on an altar covered with dust, rested the reliquary. It was a small object, but it emanated a dense, dark energy, as if it were alive. Gabriel, feeling a mixture of fear and fascination, could not resist the temptation to approach. As he took the locket in his hands, a wave of cold ran through his body. The whispers in the air intensified, and the room seemed to become even darker. However, Gabriel couldn't stop looking at him. At that moment, a spark of doubt crossed his mind, but greed overpowered him. He opened the locket. From that moment on, the world around him changed. Shadows that were once static began to move, taking on distorted and grotesque shapes. A dark figure emerged from the gloom, its red eyes glowing with an evil intensity. It was the spirit of an ancient monk, whose soul had been trapped in the reliquary for centuries. doomed to wander among the plains of the world of the living and the dead. The spirit began to whisper words in a forgotten language, and Gabriel felt his soul tremble as if the words themselves pierced his mind. The figure approached slowly, floating in the air, and its red eyes locked onto Gabriel's. A sense of indescribable horror came over him. He could feel the cold presence of death beside him, a death that watched him, waiting. The ground began to shake, and Gabriel backed away, terrified. The walls closed around him, as if the monastery were alive, trying to devour him. With each step back, the whispers became more intense, more urgent. Gabriel tried to flee, but the doors of the monastery closed with a deafening roar, and a dark shadow surrounded him completely. His breathing became erratic, and his mind began to wander. He was no longer alone. He felt presences around him, dark figures watching him in silence, waiting for his fall. The monk's spirit was advancing toward him, an invisible force pressing on his chest, making it difficult for him to breathe. The darkness surrounded him, consumed him, and Gabriel could no longer distinguish between reality and the nightmare that was unleashed around him. As the darkness advanced, Gabriel could hear a wail, as if the very walls of the monastery were weeping in agony. The monks who had guarded the reliquary, those who had sacrificed themselves to seal it, were now rising from their graves. Their rotting bodies walked through the shadows, crawling toward him, as if trapped in a prison of eternal death, seeking revenge for the breaking of the seal that had kept the dark forces at bay for centuries. Gabriel tried to scream, but his voice choked in his throat as if something was strangling him. He couldn't move, he couldn't breathe. The terror had completely paralyzed him, and all he could do was look around while the shadows closed in on him. The monk's spirit drew closer, and Gabriel could feel the coldness of his breath on his neck. The last whisper he heard was that of a warning. Death is never forgotten. Death never forgives. Suddenly, a flash of blinding light enveloped him, and the monastery began to crumble around him. The shadows, the figures, everything disintegrated, and the room was plunged into absolute silence. Gabriel was in the center of a dark void, floating in the abyss, without a body, without a soul. The reliquary had served its purpose. He had claimed what belonged to him, and so the legend of the reliquary of death was fulfilled. No one else would attempt to challenge the limits of the cursed object. The locket, now empty, was sealed again, waiting for its next challenger, its next soul to consume. There was something about the old university that had always troubled Javier. It was a place steeped in history, where the corridors stretched as if they had no end, and the walls whispered forgotten secrets. He had studied there for years, but he had always felt that something strange was hiding behind its ancient walls, something that could not be seen, but could be perceived. His curiosity as a student of history had led him to investigate every corner of that building. However, what he would discover that afternoon would change his life forever. Javier had been trapped in the library until late, as he often did when he couldn't stop studying. He was reviewing some old documents on the history of the university when, among the dusty pages of an old book, something fell to the floor. He bent down to pick it up and found a small key, made of a strange, opaque, almost black metal. It was heavy in his hands, and the feeling it conveyed was not of something ordinary. A strange feeling of uneasiness took hold of his body, a pressure in his chest that he could not explain. Despite the strange vibration emitted by the key, his curiosity got the better of him. He decided to keep it in his backpack, not knowing what connection it would have with what he was about to experience. That night, as he was returning to his room, Javier passed near a corridor that had always seemed desolate and gloomy to him. It was located in an old wing of the university that was rarely visited by students. The hallway was dimly lit by warm light lamps that created eerie shadows on the stone walls. At first, he didn't pay much attention to it, but something stopped him. He looked at a door at the end of the hall, a door he had never noticed before. She was almost hidden by a heavy curtain that fell to the floor, and the key in her hand seemed to whisper to her. He felt he had to get closer. The air was thick and cold as Javier approached the door. He didn't know why, but he felt like his heart was beating faster. With a trembling hand, he took the key out of his backpack and inserted it into the lock. The door opened with a dull creak as if it had been closed for centuries. The room beyond was plunged into darkness, but a strange energy emanated from it. Javier took a step inside, and instantly the atmosphere seemed to become heavier. as if the atmosphere was impregnated with something old and forgotten. A strange echo echoed in his ears, as if someone or something was watching him from the darkness. The feeling of being watched grew, and Javier felt that something was not right. His breathing quickened. Then, in the midst of the gloom, something moved. Soft steps, almost imperceptible, but close enough to make his skin stand on end. Javier turned, looking for the source of that noise, but he saw nothing. The door closed behind him with a thud that made him jump with a start. Instantly, a shudder ran through his body. What he saw next was a vision he could never erase from his mind. An endless corridor stretched out before him, so dark that it seemed to devour the light. However, there was something else, something I couldn't comprehend. The shadows moved, stretched, and shrank around them as if they had a life of their own. The air became even denser, and the silence became unbearable. Then, from the depths of darkness, a voice whispered his name. It wasn't a human voice, nor was it a familiar whisper. It was an unnatural, guttural murmur that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Javier. The voice not only called him by name, but spoke to his soul, filling it with indescribable terror. The shadows began to move more quickly, as if attracted by his presence. Javier felt that something was stalking him, that he was not alone, and at that moment a shiver ran down his spine. A sound, similar to a heavy sigh, slid through the walls, getting closer with every breath I took. At first, Javier thought it was his imagination, a simple illusion created by the darkness of the corridor. But then, a dark shadow, denser than the void itself, materialized before him. It was the form of a human being, but its eyes shone with an unearthly, empty light, as if there was no life inside. The figure did not walk. It floated, gliding on the ground with a spectral grace. Javier tried to back away, but his feet seemed to be glued to the ground, as if the corridor itself was holding him back. The figure began to slowly approach, and Javier could hear the cracking of his own bones as he tried to move. The shadow stared at him, its empty eyes fixed on his. An icy cold enveloped his body, making him shiver violently. The figure whispered something that Javier could not understand, but the sensation it produced was clear. Death was stalking him. Desperate, Javier tried to run, but his legs did not respond. Shadows rose around him, enveloping him. A mocking, sinister, and resounding laugh filled the air, as if the very walls were laughing at their suffering. A dark, oppressive energy crushed him, pushed him forward into the unknown. There was no escape. The darkness devoured him. When he finally managed to take a step, the feeling of being watched grew even more. He realized that he was not alone in that hallway, that other presences surrounded him. Formless beings, wandering shadows that seemed to feed on his fear. He could feel their piercing gazes, as if their eyes were piercing him, and for a moment, Javier felt his very soul fade under the weight of those empty eyes. As he moved forward, the corridor seemed to get longer and longer. The murmurs of the shadows intensified, and a strange heat began to invade the atmosphere. But it was not the warmth of a friendly presence. It was the heat of something evil, as if hell itself was taking shape around him. A shiver ran down his spine when, in the darkness, he heard a clearer voice, this time human. A man's voice, raspy, broken by time. "Why have you come here?" Javier turned quickly, looking for the source of the voice, but there was nothing, just shadows, twisted and dark. The voice seemed to come from everywhere, echoing in his head. An unbearable weight accumulated in his chest. The pressure was getting more and more intense. The dark figure drew nearer and nearer, and the cold of death caressed his face. The voice resounded again. "This place is not for you. What you find here can never be undone." Javier wanted to scream, but his lips wouldn't move. He tried to turn back, but the corridor closed around him, as if the darkness itself had caught him. Shadows began to advance towards him, taking shape, becoming human figures, their eyes empty and their mouths open in a grotesque grimace. "Run!" shouted an inner voice, but Javier could no longer move. The last shadow, the largest and darkest, slipped toward him and stretched out a spectral hand toward his face. The feeling of cold intensified, until all Javier could feel was nothingness. And then the corridor fell into absolute silence. The door, the one he had opened, closed again. The key disappeared, leaving behind a forgotten corridor, awaiting the arrival of the next victim. A man named Marcos was in a small antique market on the outskirts of town, looking for something unique to decorate his house. He had visited several stores, but none of them seemed to offer what he was looking for. The sun was beginning to set, tinting the sky a faint orange, as soft light illuminated the old, dusty objects that lined the shelves. There was something special about that market, something that attracted the curious and lovers of the old. However, she did not know that that afternoon would change her life forever. In the far corner of the antique store, something caught his eye. It was a mirror covered with a black velvet cloth. Its frame, carved from dark wood, seemed centuries old. But what really captivated Mark was the strange energy emanating from it. Without thinking much, he approached and, with a fearful gesture, lifted the cloth that covered him. The first thing he noticed was the reflection. The mirror did not show the antique shop as one would expect. Instead, it reflected a dark corridor covered in shadows. It was as if, somehow, the mirror was a portal to another place, a place that had nothing to do with the reality I knew. The salesman, a strange-looking and aged man, observed Marcos's reaction. "That mirror, it has a history. He's not like the others," she said in a raspy voice. "It is said that it shows what we do not want to see, what we fear." Mark, intrigued by the mysterious warning, asked more, but the man simply waved his hand. "What you see cannot be erased. If you decide to take it, don't go back to me for answers." Without thinking about it any longer, Marcos paid the price and took the mirror, ignorant of what awaited him. From the moment she placed him in her house, a sense of unease began to wash over her. It was as if something was constantly watching him. I couldn't stop looking at the mirror, but as I did, I began to feel a presence. At first, it was just a whisper in his mind, a passing sensation that he quickly dismissed as suggested by the salesman's story. But as night fell, things began to change. As the daylight faded and darkness invaded his home, he began to notice something strange in the reflection of the mirror. A movement, something that slipped through the shadows of that corridor that appeared in the glass. It wasn't something clear or defined, but something was definitely moving, something that shouldn't be there. Mark, with a mixture of curiosity and terror, approached the mirror, observing more closely. It was then that he saw her for the first time. A female figure, her face obscured by long dark hair, appeared in the reflection. His body was on its back, but his movements were unsettling, as if he was slowly walking towards him, unhurriedly. Fear took hold of him, but the worst was yet to come. Each night, as I looked in the mirror, the figure began to get closer and closer, until the time came when I could clearly see his face. A pale face without eyes, with an empty expression, a macabre grimace that seemed to follow him, to observe him without rest. When Mark turned to look around his house, he found nothing out of the ordinary. But when she turned her gaze to the mirror, the woman was closer than she had ever imagined. As the days went by, the presence of the figure began to become more tangible, more oppressive. During the night hours, Marcos could not sleep. He always felt that something was watching him, something that was stalking him in the dark. In his house, a feeling of lingering cold began to spread to every corner. The air seemed to become dense, as if an invisible pressure enveloped him, making it difficult for him to breathe, as if each inhalation was a painful exertion. He tried to ignore the images he saw in the mirror, but he couldn't. He couldn't stop looking, as if an invisible force was forcing him to do so. Each time he looked away, the woman's figure seemed closer, more alive, more real. I felt her empty gaze fixed on him, feeling the weight of his presence in every corner of the room. The figure was not only watching him from the mirror, but began to manifest outside of it. Marcos saw strange shadows in the reflection, figures fading and appearing, as if the house itself were being invaded by that dark corridor. Sometimes I heard footsteps, faint whispers that could not be explained. His mind was filled with dark thoughts, as if something was inside him, controlling his thoughts and his body. One night, unable to bear it any longer, he tried to get rid of the mirror. He covered it with a blanket, kept it in the basement, but the woman's feeling never went away. In his dreams, she was chasing him, her empty eyes fixed on him, getting closer and closer until darkness enveloped him completely. I woke up in a cold sweat, feeling that something had changed. Something had crossed into the real world from the reflection. That's when the figure began to speak, a soft, almost whispering voice that didn't come from any physical place, but that he could hear clearly in his mind. "I've been watching you, Marcos. I followed you from the moment you first looked at me. You're mine now, and you always will be." The words completely froze him. Each night the visits became more frequent, and the woman's presence began to take on a more solid shape. Terror consumed him, but there was no escape. In the mirrors of each room, the woman appeared, always closer, always more threatening. He began to lose track of time. He spent his nights staring at the reflection, caught by its empty gaze, as if something inside him was holding him captive. The shadows grew longer in every corner of the house, and fear enveloped him more with each passing hour. One afternoon, while he was in front of the mirror, Marcos saw something he never imagined. The woman's figure began to come out of the reflection. First, his fingers touching the glass, then a full hand, until the figure completely slid into the real world. His skin was cold, his body thin and twisted, as if he were a shadow in human form. His face was completely empty with no eyes, but his lips curled into a malevolent smile. Marcos tried to scream, but his voice choked in his throat. He couldn't move, he couldn't escape. The woman approached him, her cold and long fingers touching his face, caressing his skin as if it were a macabre caress. He could feel the chill of her presence enveloping him, an indescribable sense of terror paralyzing him, as if he were trapped in a nightmare that would never end. The figure spoke again, his voice now louder, deeper. "Now you are mine forever. You'll never escape me. You are condemned to live in my reflection." Marcos tried to move away, but his body was no longer responding. Darkness surrounded him, and the figure dragged him into the mirror. Their screams were silenced, and the house fell into a deadly silence. From that moment on, no one saw Marcos again. The house was empty, his mirror there in the same place where he had left it. The reflection, as always, showed that dark corridor, with a female figure walking slowly, getting closer and closer, a presence that stalked those who dared to look. The eyeless woman continued her journey like a shadow that never goes out, always waiting for the next victim who dared to buy the mirror. The antiques market still exists, but no one remembers the man who disappeared in the reflection, nor the warning he left behind. The mirror is still waiting, hidden in a corner, with the figure of the lady watching those who approach, waiting for the right moment to come out again. Since time immemorial, the small town of San Sebastian had lived under the shadow of a mysterious bell that could be heard in the distance. The bell, an ancient piece of bronze that hung atop the village church, had a sound that echoed through the mountains. It was not just any bell, its toll was heard in moments of great anguish, marking the proximity of death. As the years passed, the villagers began to get used to it, but they also learned to fear it. When the bell rang, someone was going to die, and everyone knew it. The sound was deep, heavy, as if the wind itself shrank in his presence. Some said that it was the voice of a soul trapped between two worlds, while others claimed that the bell was cursed, condemned to ring every time the life of an inhabitant was extinguished. The elders of the village remembered that it had been installed generations ago by a priest who disappeared without a trace. No one had ever managed to decipher the true origin of the bell. Everyone was afraid to approach her. The people had survived generations of suffering, always with the same curse lurking. The deaths came with the sound of the bell, which never failed, never stopped. In the darkness of the night, its sound penetrated the houses of the inhabitants, announcing the fate of some of them. Some tried to ignore it, but everyone knew that if the bell rang, death was near. On a stormy night, the sound of the bell was louder than ever. He struck with an intensity that seemed to reverberate in the bowels of the people. Each blow was a terrifying echo, echoing off the walls of the houses, shaking the hearts of the bravest. No one in the village had ever heard such a loud and ominous ringing. Anguish took hold of all who heard that sound, which reached the depths of their souls. But that night, there was someone who did not give in to fear. Alejandro, a brave young man determined to discover the truth behind the bell, decided to investigate. He had heard many stories and legends about his origin, but the need for answers had led him to challenge superstitions. As the storm raged, Alejandro left his house with a flashlight in hand. I knew something wasn't right, but I was willing to face the unknown. The streets of the town were deserted, the windows closed and the doors barred. The houses, normally full of life, had become mausoleums, all the inhabitants fearful of the bell. Alejandro walked through the deserted alleys, the wind whipping his face, but he did not hesitate. The church, which stood like a dark giant on the top of the hill, was waiting for him. I knew that there I would find the answer. The bell could not be the only mystery in that place. Something else was hidden. Something else was waiting to be revealed. As he ascended the steep path that led to the church, the fog thickened, enveloping everything around him. The light of the lantern trembled with every step he took, as if darkness were trying to swallow everything in its path. The sound of the bell kept ringing louder and louder, closer and closer. It was as if the bell itself was calling him, guiding him to his destination. When he reached the doors of the church, Alejandro felt a chill run down his spine. The doors, which had always been closed, were now ajar, as if they were waiting for him. Without thinking, he pushed the door hard, and as he crossed the threshold, the cold air enveloped him. The church, normally a place of peace, was now plunged into dense darkness. There was no light except for Alexander's lantern, which struggled to light the way. The sound of the bell seemed to come from deep within the church. Alexander walked slowly toward the altar, his footsteps echoing on the stone floor. As he advanced, the darkness seemed to take on a life of its own, as if shadows were watching his every move. The walls of the church rose like giants, and the roof seemed to crumble above his head. The figures carved into the stone, the statues of the saints, looked strange, deformed by the darkness. Finally, he reached the altar where the bell hung overhead just above a stone pedestal. It was huge, its size huge, and its presence overwhelming. There were no visible strings or mechanisms, and yet the bell kept ringing, non-stop. Alexander, paralyzed with terror, looked up at the altar and saw something that made him shudder. An old book, covered in dust and dark stains, rested on the pedestal. A pale glow emanated from its pages. With trembling hands, Alejandro brought the lantern closer to the book. When he opened it, a feeling of discomfort invaded him, as if the church itself breathed with him. The words of the book seemed to move, change, twist, as if the text were alive. And at that moment, a whispering voice echoed in his mind. "You have awakened what was asleep." The words floated in the air, and the sound of the bell increased in intensity, resounding in every corner of the church. The temperature dropped rapidly, and Alejandro felt a pressure in his chest, as if something invisible was crushing him. The book lit up with a sinister glow, and the shadows on the walls began to move, to lengthen, as if they were coming to life. In an instant, the altar was transformed. What was once a sacred space became a prison. A gigantic shadow emerged from the darkness, a spectral figure, his face diffuse but full of evil. His eyes flashed with a red light, as if he was looking through Alexander's soul. The figure approached slowly, floating in the air, and with each step it took, the bell rang louder as if its tolling marked the end of time. Alejandro tried to back up, but his legs did not respond. I was trapped, caught in the curse of the bell, caught in a cycle that would never end. The figure caught up with him, and an overwhelming cold came over him. The being spoke in a guttural whisper, words that Alejandro did not understand, but which resounded in his mind like a terrifying echo. "The town is scarred," said the shadow, his voice penetrating every corner of the church. "And you, Alejandro, have sealed your fate. They will all fall under the weight of the bell." Maria had always been a very talented artist. His brushes, guided by his trembling hands, managed to capture the deepest part of the human soul on each canvas. However, despite his success, he was never able to find a true connection to the masterpiece he felt he was meant to create. He wanted something bigger, something that would define his career and his life. So he had decided to retreat to a cottage in the country, away from the hustle and bustle of the city, in search of that spark of inspiration he was so missing. The cabin was located in a remote location, surrounded by a dense forest that seemed to have been forgotten by time. When Maria arrived, the first thing she noticed was the heavy, dense air, as if nature itself were watching her. The wooden walls creaked under the weight of the years, and the wind that whispered through the cracks of the cabin seemed to carry echoes of distant voices. Maria, however, did not pay much attention to it. She was determined to find what she was looking for, the inspiration for her masterpiece. It was several days before Maria began to feel the weight of loneliness. During the day, he would dedicate himself to painting, capturing the essence of nature on canvases. But as night fell, the atmosphere in the cabin became more and more oppressive. The creaking of the wood and the whispers of the wind were beginning to take on an unsettling hue, as if someone were watching her. One afternoon, after several failed attempts to find inspiration, Maria decided that her next portrait would be different. Instead of the tranquil landscape she had been painting, she decided to create a portrait of herself. He wanted to capture the deepest look of his soul, the one he had never shown to the world. He got ready, placed the canvas on the easel, and began to paint, letting himself be carried away by his darkest emotions. As he moved forward, he began to feel a strange sensation, as if something was happening in the air. But he decided to ignore it and continue. The paint on her face was beginning to take shape, and although at first it was only a reflection of herself, something was beginning to change. His eyes on the canvas seemed more alive, more intense. Suddenly the lines of the portrait seemed to move, as if the image was breathing. Maria put the brush down in her hand and watched, horrified. It couldn't be possible. The portrait was moving, his eyes sliding back and forth as if searching for something in the dark. A cold sweat ran down his back. What was happening? He tried to give it a few more touches, but as he did so, the figure seemed to come to life. Suddenly the portrait began to cry. He cried blood. A torrent of red poured from his eyes, bathing the canvas as the paint distorted as if a tormented soul was trapped inside. Maria backed away in horror, paralyzed by fear. The screams of the figure in the portrait seemed to resonate in her mind, a sound she could not understand but which filled her with terror. The portrait seemed to be watching her with fury, with hatred. It wasn't his own reflection that was painted on the canvas, but something much darker, something that had never existed in his real life. Trembling, Maria tried to cover the portrait with a cloth, but she couldn't get out of his sight. The painting cried incessantly, as if it were alive. As the hours passed, the crying became louder, more unbearable. Every tear of blood fell to the floor, causing the room to be filled with a metallic smell, and the atmosphere became more and more oppressive. Something was wrong. Something very wrong. The portrait didn't just cry. He was beginning to move more, squirming on the canvas as if he were looking for a way out. Maria, terrified, began to hear whispers coming from the portrait. Every word was incomprehensible, but every single one of them resonated in his mind with terrifying force. He covered his ears with his hands, but whispers seeped into his mind, as if an evil presence was taking control of his thoughts. In desperation, Maria tried to leave the cabin, but the doors slammed shut as if the cabin itself wanted to trap her. The air was becoming thick, and the walls seemed to shrink around him. Every corner was filled with shadows that moved, as if they were lurking, waiting. The cabin was no longer a refuge, it had become a trap. The painter began to feel how the energy of painting enveloped her. The figure in the portrait called to her, attracted her. Every time he looked at the canvas, he felt part of his soul detach and join the portrait. Fear consumed her, but she couldn't get away. He knew he had to destroy the painting, but he didn't know how. Each attempt to touch the portrait only made the figure more alive, as if every brushstroke he added strengthened it. One night, while trying to sleep, he was awakened by a strange noise. The cry of the painting called to her, but this time there was something else. The whispers were clearer, more direct. The voice that emanated from the painting was hers, as if it were she herself who cried, who asked for help. Maria began to feel something inside her change. Desperation took hold of her. The terror I felt was no longer just because of what I saw, but because of what I was beginning to understand. The figure in the portrait was not only a representation of her, but was taking her place, absorbing her essence, her life. If I didn't destroy the portrait, I would end up being part of it, trapped on the canvas forever. In desperation, Maria took a knife and began cutting the canvas, attempting to destroy the figure before it was too late. But each cut only made the figure more powerful. The shadows in the room were twisting, and the cabin began to vibrate as if something dark was waking up. With each cut, the portrait cried louder, and the blood that fell from the canvas began to drip onto the floor, forming dark puddles that seemed to swallow everything they touched. Terror took hold of her completely. I could no longer distinguish between the real thing and what I was seeing in the painting. His mind was cracking, and the whispers were turning into unbearable screams. The figure in the portrait was no longer just looking at her. Now he pointed at her as if he were condemning her. Mary knew that she had no time, that she had to destroy it immediately. With one last effort, he took the portrait and threw it into the fire in the fireplace. The canvas began to burn, but the scream that the figure uttered when the fire touched it was the most frightful he had ever heard. The flames seemed to devour the paint, but something else was happening. The shadows that had once moved around the hut were now concentrated in the fire, as if they wanted to prevent the portrait from disappearing. When the portrait was finally consumed in the flames, the hut fell silent. The air cleared and the oppressive atmosphere began to dissipate. Maria fell to the ground, exhausted but relieved. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, had disappeared. However, when he looked at his hands, he noticed something strange. His skin was beginning to take on a gray hue as if it was crumbling. His body felt light, almost ethereal, and his face reflected an expression of horror that he had never seen before. At that moment, he understood what had happened. She hadn't destroyed the portrait. The portrait had destroyed her. In the stillness of a remote corner of the forest, where the shadows of the trees stretched like the arms of a sleeping giant, a man named Marcos arrives at an isolated cabin to escape the busy city life. I had heard about the beauty of nature in that place, and the tranquility it offered. No worries, no pressures, no constant invasion of the modern world. Just him and the landscape. That was all he needed to rest from his daily routine. The cottage, though rustic and somewhat dated, had the charm of the old days with a stone fireplace, large windows overlooking the thick forest, and a sense of seclusion that pleased him. It was everything you could want for a solo holiday, without the interference of people or the bustle of everyday life. That night, after a day exploring the forest, he lit a fire in the fireplace and sat down on the sofa, deep in thought. The creaking of burning wood was the only sound that interrupted the deep silence of the night. Shadows danced on the walls of the cabin, as the darkness outside stretched beyond the reach of the light. He went to bed early that night, exhausted from the walk, but something in the air kept him restless. There was something strange about the stillness, something I couldn't identify. He tried to calm his mind, but the feeling persisted. He closed his eyes and fell into a restless sleep. Dawn came with a faint glow, barely filtered through the leaves that covered the windows. Mark woke up abruptly, feeling a strange pressure in the air. It was not the sound of the wind, nor the nature that I used to hear in the morning. Something felt different, as if the atmosphere were charged with an unsettling energy. When he got out of bed, he noticed something strange. On the floor of the room, right in front of the door, there was a large footprint, bright red, as if someone had left a mark on the ground, but it looked like anything else. The footprint wasn't just fresh blood. It was as if the mark was alive, latent, as if it had been left behind by something far more sinister than a simple accident. Marcos approached cautiously, the air in the room weighing on him like a blanket. The footprint stretched across the floor, leading to the door of the cabin. Trembling, he bent down to examine her more closely. It wasn't a mistake, nor something that could have been left by accident. It was a clear mark, an ominous sign that seemed to mock him. The footprint did not end there. When he opened the door, he noticed that he continued down the hallway, down the stairs to the main entrance of the cabin. Panic began to take hold of him, but curiosity grew stronger. He decided to follow the track, although he felt the weight of fear crushing his chest. As the footprint moved along the outside of the cabin, the feeling that something was watching him intensified. The nature around was in complete silence. Not the wind, not the birds, not the insects. Only the sound of his own footsteps stepping on the damp earth. The footprint led him into the forest, a shadowy path that led into the thick trees. Every step he took into the heart of the forest seemed to make him farther away from the safety of the cabin. The daylight was no longer enough to dispel the shadows which seemed to lengthen towards him, slowly surrounding him. Gradually, the footprint began to show an increasingly grotesque shape. Instead of being just a mark of blood, it now seemed to be accompanied by strange distortions, as if the terrain itself was being altered by something invisible. The earth was marked by strange signs, ancient symbols that I could not comprehend. The panic began to turn into something deeper. Mark tried to turn back, but the footprint drew him, as if he had a will of his own, as if something in the forest was calling him, guiding him. In his attempt to return to the cabin, he noticed that the forest looked different now. The treetops, once familiar, now looked strange, as if they were watching him, as if they knew him. A shudder ran down his spine. When he arrived at a clearing in the forest, he saw something that completely paralyzed him. In the center of the clearing, there was a figure erect, standing, waiting. The figure was indistinct, without clear features, but its presence was terrifying. It wasn't human, but it seemed to have a form, a structure. An echo of his humanity, but distorted. The bloody footprint had led him there. And as he approached, the figure moved. The scene in front of him crumbled into chaos. The earth began to tremble and the air became dense, as if an invisible force imprisoned it. The figure in the clearing dissolved, and the shadows of the trees began to twist, growing towards him. The ground split, and what seemed like an unbreakable peace turned into a nightmare of horror and despair. Marcos tried to run, but each step he took plunged him deeper into darkness. The bloody footprint, like a threat from the unknown, haunted him. Every time he turned, he saw the distortions in the air, the symbols gliding over the ground. The trees seemed to move, as if they were part of a sentient entity, watching him, stalking. The horror reached its peak when it reached the edge of a precipice. The forest seemed to have engulfed him, and all that remained was emptiness. The bloody footprint was there on the edge of the abyss, and Mark, now completely plunged into terror, saw a figure emerge from the shadows, his own reflection distorted, grotesque, standing in front of him. And then, as if all the accumulated terror had only one purpose, the footprint began to drag him away. A violent tug pushed him into the abyss, into the void, as the shadows devoured him completely. The man disappeared into the darkness of the forest, and the man, the bloody one, as if it had never existed, vanished into the earth. The echo of his cry echoed in the distance, but no one heard him. The forest, again in silence, kept the last vestige of its passage, until another visitor arrived, unwary to follow the trail of the bloody track. The scene in front of him crumbled into chaos. The earth began to tremble, and the air became dense, as if an invisible force imprisoned it. The figure in the clearing dissolved, and the shadows of the trees began to twist, growing towards him. The ground split, and what seemed like an unbreakable peace turned into a nightmare of horror and despair. Marcos tried to run, but each step he took plunged him deeper into darkness. The bloody footprint, like a threat from the unknown, haunted him. Every time he turned, he saw the distortions in the air, the symbols gliding over the ground. The trees seemed to move, as if they were part of a sentient entity, watching him, stalking. The horror reached its peak when it reached the edge of a precipice. The forest seemed to have engulfed him, and all that remained was emptiness. The bloody footprint was there on the edge of the abyss, and Mark, now completely plunged into terror, saw a figure emerge from the shadows, his own reflection distorted, grotesque, standing in front of him. And then, as if all the accumulated terror had only one purpose, the footprint began to drag him away. A violent tug pushed him into the abyss, into the void, as the shadows devoured him completely. The man disappeared into the darkness of the forest, and the man, the bloody one, as if it had never existed, vanished into the earth. The echo of his cry echoed in the distance, but no one heard him. The forest, again in silence, kept the last vestige of its passage, until another visitor arrived, unwary to follow the trail of the bloody track. The rain was pouring down on the small town. An icy wind whipped through the windows of the car while Lara watched through the foggy glass. He had traveled hundreds of miles to get there, following the clues his mother had left him in an old letter. In it, he told her about the cabin in which he had grown up, a place that seemed to be shrouded in mystery and darkness. Lara had never met her grandmother, and her mother never spoke of her, but there was something about the tone of the letter that had intrigued her, a kind of call she couldn't ignore. The car stopped in front of the cottage's entrance, an old building surrounded by twisted trees that seemed to whisper to each other. Lara took a deep breath before getting out of the vehicle, feeling the humidity of the night take over her skin. As he approached the door of the cabin, the air became heavier, as if the place was waiting for something. He entered the cabin, and the first shiver ran down his spine. The air was stale, permeated with a smell of old wood and dampness. The dim light of an oil lamp illuminated the walls, covered in dust and cobwebs. The wooden beams creaked softly, as if the place breathed on its own. Lara watched every corner cautiously, her mind filled with unanswered questions. At first, everything seemed calm. He decided to explore, looking for some clues about his family's history. He had heard rumors that the hut had been built on ancestral land, but the details were vague and fuzzy. As he walked through the halls, something caught his attention. A small wooden door at the back of the house, barely visible in the shadows. Without thinking, he approached and opened it. On the other side, he found a staircase that descended into a dark, damp basement. At that moment, a strange echo echoed through the hut, a low murmur that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Lara stopped, her eyes widening in surprise. Was there anyone else in the cabin? The echo seemed to call out to her, as if someone was whispering her name, but when she looked around, the house was empty. A shiver ran through her body, but she decided to go downstairs, driven by a curiosity she couldn't resist. The basement was dark and cold. The light from the lamp barely shone a few feet in front of her. Lara moved slowly, the echo of her own footsteps echoing in the empty space. In the background, something glowed faintly, something that appeared to be an old, dust-covered object. He approached cautiously, and when he picked it up, he found a wooden box, old and worn, with intricate engravings on its surface. Unable to help it, Lara opened the box, and inside she found letters, photographs, and other personal belongings. As he flipped through the papers, an icy wind suddenly picked up, extinguishing the oil lamp. Darkness enveloped everything, and Lara stood still, feeling an invisible pressure begin to envelop her. It was then that she heard the first whisper clearly. "Lara?" The voice was distant but terrifying, a low wail that seemed to come from the walls themselves, as if something was trying to communicate with her. Lara recoiled instinctively, tripping over an old chair that fell to the floor with a deafening noise. Instantly, the house seemed to come to life. The echoes multiplied, the voices intertwined, calling her, shouting her name. He covered his ears with his hands, but he couldn't block out the sound. Suddenly, the atmosphere changed. The air became thicker, denser, as if something was filling the space with a palpable presence. The murmur morphed into a deep, distorted voice that echoed in his ears. "Get out!" the voice commanded. But Lara couldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in the darkness of that basement, surrounded by echoes that never ended. At that moment, something moved in the corner of the room, a shadow that seemed to slip between the walls. Lara turned quickly, but there was nothing there. He couldn't explain it, but something told him that he shouldn't stay in that place. The feeling of being watched intensified, as if the eyes of countless unseen presences were fixed on her. Her breathing quickened and panic began to take hold of her. Suddenly, a clanging noise cut through the air. The basement door slammed shut. Lara jumped, but the pressure in the air did not disappear. A shiver ran through her body as she realized she was trapped. What had started as a visit to the cabin to discover his family's history had turned into a nightmare. Something dark and evil was present in the house, something that had been waiting for his arrival. Desperate, she began to look for a way out. He knocked on the walls, tried to open the door, but it was all useless. The presence in the house became stronger, more aggressive. The echoes of the voices turned into deafening screams, and the shadowy figure she had seen in the corner of the basement was now closer, getting closer and closer to her. Lara spun quickly, but the shadow faded before she could see her clearly. It was then that a figure appeared in front of her, emerging from the darkness. A man with a pale face and empty eyes was staring at her. Lara tried to scream, but her voice trailed off in her throat, gripped by terror. The figure wasn't moving, but his eyes reflected an endless emptiness, as if his soul had been ripped out and replaced by something much darker. The figure began to speak in a language Lara couldn't understand, but the sense of horror grew with each word she uttered. It was as if the figure was communicating with her through more than just words, as if it was touching her mind, penetrating her deepest thoughts. "Get out," the figure whispered, but Lara couldn't move a single muscle. The presence around her became denser, as if the hut itself were alive, breathing with her. Panic overflowed in her mind, but Lara couldn't do anything. The darkness seemed to swallow everything, and the echoes of the voices were intertwined with his own thoughts. "I don't want to die here," he thought, but it was useless. The figure stepped forward, and Lara felt an unbearable pressure in her chest. Her mind was filled with distorted images, memories of her family's past, fragments of voices and laughter that mingled with the screams that now surrounded her. The ground beneath his feet began to shake. The echoes became louder, more aggressive, as if the house itself was reacting to their presence. Lara fought to free herself, but the voices pushed her into the abyss. A sinister laugh rang in her ear, and as she turned, she saw a gigantic shadow sliding towards her. At that moment, the house seemed to explode in a burst of terror. The walls creaked, the windows shattered, and the figure in front of her disappeared in a flash of darkness. Lara fell to the ground, exhausted, struggling to breathe. But something inside him knew that he had won. It had survived the echo of the past. The cabin was located deep in a dense forest where the echo of the wind seemed to be silenced as it moved through the trees. No one bothered to come this way, and that was exactly what made the place ideal for the party they had planned. A group of friends, between laughter and jokes, had decided to get away from it all, disconnect from the noise of the city, and spend a weekend with friends. No one imagined that this choice would be the worst mistake of their lives. The cabin, although small and old, had something cozy about it. The wooden ceiling creaked under the weight of time, but the walls, though worn, seemed to have their own character. A place away from civilization where they could do whatever they wanted without worrying about being disturbed. The arrival was simple. The car went up a steep dirt road, and when they finally arrived, they all went out in unison, eager to see the place. Laughter filled the air as they unloaded their suitcases and settled into the space. Night after night, the group became more and more relaxed. They talked about everything: old stories, anecdotes, rumors that were told about that part of the forest. But no one at the time stopped to think about the meaning of those stories. The idea that the place was marked by something strange, something they shouldn't have touched, was just superstition. That night, the temperature had dropped dramatically. The flames of the fire crackled, warming the central room where they stood. Candlelight flickered, creating shadows that danced against the walls, and laughter followed one after another, while the group played a board game without worrying about time. It was a typical winter night in the woods, but when the conversation began to wane, something in the air changed. The breeze that was once gentle transformed into a strange whisper as if something was watching. They all felt it at the same time, like a chill running down their spine. "Did you hear that?" one of the girls asked, her voice hesitant. The others were silent, trying to catch that sound that had frozen their skin. A crunch, a whisper. Something was moving outside the cabin. "It's just the wind," one of the boys tried to reassure them, but his voice didn't sound convinced. Suddenly, the candles shook as if a gust of wind had touched them, but the windows were closed. In an instant, the darkness of the night grew denser, and the sound of the rustling branches intensified, as if the forest itself began to approach them. That's when something strange happened. The moon, which had previously been seen through the window, disappeared completely, plunging everything into impenetrable darkness. The hut, which until that moment seemed safe, now felt vulnerable, as if nature itself had ceased to protect it. "What happened to the moon?" asked a girl in a trembling voice, looking up at the sky. The darkness was so deep that not even the stars were visible. "It must be an eclipse," one of the boys suggested, but his tone didn't convince anyone. Something was not right. The feeling of being watched intensified, and a heavy weight seemed to have settled on his shoulders. The air began to grow colder, and the silence outside the cabin became deep, almost suffocating. In that silence, everyone could clearly hear their heartbeats racing and synchronized. "I'm going to look outside," said the most daring boy, Tomas. Although he wasn't entirely sure what he'd felt, something was pushing him out. Everyone fell silent as he made his way to the door, which creaked as it opened. The fog had begun to lift, darkening the surroundings even more. Thomas took a step out of the cabin, and the cold enveloped him immediately. The air was dense, as if the atmosphere itself were charged with a strange pressure. He looked up at the sky, but there was no moon, only a blackness so deep that it seemed to swallow everything in its path. He turned to return to the interior when suddenly he heard a whisper beside him. A low, distorted whisper, as if someone or something is calling him. He turned sharply but saw nothing. The fog enveloped him completely, making him feel trapped. "This is not right," he muttered to himself, hurrying back to the cabin. But just as he was about to take a step toward the door, he heard a low creak as if something was crawling behind him. "Thomas!" his friends shouted from inside, but he did not answer. The door closed by itself, and silence returned to the cabin. No one dared to move, but their minds were filled with questions. What had happened to Thomas? At that moment, something slipped under the door, an almost imperceptible touch that only those closest to it could hear. It was as if a shadow without any form was lurking. The darkness wasn't just outside. Now something had infiltrated inside the cabin. In the distance, one of the boys, Lucas, tried to light a flashlight, but he couldn't get it to turn on. Somehow the darkness turned it off, absorbed any attempt at light. In the distance, at the edge of vision, something moved rapidly, and a piercing scream echoed from outside. Without thinking, the group got up and ran to the window. But when they looked, they saw nothing, only more darkness. Something was stalking them, something hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. But the worst was not what they could see. It was what they could not see. As the hours passed, the tension in the cabin increased. Fear took hold of each of them, and soon paranoia set in. No one wanted to be alone. No one dared to go out into the dark. They were trapped. Something was stalking them, and the moon, which no longer existed, had shown them the true face of that darkness that surrounded them. but no one yet knew what was stalking them or how they could escape. All they knew was that if they didn't find a solution soon, one by one they would disappear, swallowed by the same darkness that had surrounded them that moonless night. It was a gray day when Daniel and Laura decided to escape the hustle and bustle of the city. After months of constant stress, they decided that all they needed was the fresh air of the forest and the tranquility of a cabin away from everything. A couple of days, just the two of them, surrounded by nature, where they could relax without worries. The cabin they rented was in a small, secluded corner, where there were no houses nearby and hardly any phone signals. The road meandered between tall trees that towered like giants, mostly covering the sunlight. When they arrived, they realized how far away everything really was. There was not a store, not a sign of human life for miles around. The cabin was small, rustic but cozy. Outside, time seemed to have stopped, as if it were a refuge forgotten by all. "This is perfect," Laura said, dropping her suitcase on the dusty porch floor. "We need this. Time to disconnect." Daniel smiled, though he couldn't deny that something in the air was strange to him. There was something unsettling about the stillness of the place. But he ignored it, thinking it was just his mind burdened by the pressures of the city. What he didn't know was that the calm they longed for would be interrupted by something much more terrifying. The cabin had the essentials: a fireplace that crackled softly, a kitchenette, and a couple of cozy rooms. As they settled in, Daniel and Laura felt more relaxed, forgetting the stresses of work and everyday life. But soon, the first shadows of uneasiness began to appear. That night, after a quiet dinner by the fire, they retired to their room. As Laura settled into bed, Daniel leaned out of the window, looking out the forest around the cabin. The full moon was high in the sky, but it wasn't enough to illuminate the thickness of the trees. "I couldn't help but feel a sense of being watched, even though I couldn't see anything." "Is everything okay?" asked Laura from the bed. "Yes, just the silence is so absolute here," Daniel replied, closing the curtain and turning off the light. But when he tried to sleep, Daniel's sleep was interrupted by strange noises, a distant creak, as if something or someone is moving through the trees. At first he thought it might be an animal, but then the sound repeated, closer, as if someone was approaching the cabin. Daniel tried to ignore it, blaming it on the stress and loneliness of the place. But the creaks continued until a loud bang made him get out of bed. "Did you hear that?" Daniel whispered, looking at Laura, who was already awake. She nodded, looking out the window. "Yes, as if someone is nearby. Should we go and look?" "Number. Let's better stay here and check tomorrow. It's very dark outside." Laura wasn't so sure. Something in the air kept her alert, but she trusted Daniel and the cabin was safe, or so she thought. The next morning, they didn't mention the noises of the night. The light of day brought with it a false sense of security. They decided to take a walk in the woods, exploring the surroundings. As they walked, Daniel felt the strange sensation of being watched again. Every time he turned his head, he saw nothing, but the feeling lingered, as if something was watching them from the shadows of the trees. "I don't know, Laura. This place scares me a little. Perhaps we should have looked for something closer to civilization." "Come on, don't be paranoid. It's just a forest and we're all alone." "There's something soothing about this silence," Laura replied, though she also felt a growing discomfort in her chest. As they moved deeper into the forest, the sound of their footsteps and the breeze moving the leaves of the trees were the only things that broke the silence. But as they advanced, something else began to add tension to the atmosphere. Some branches creaked near them, and when they looked, they saw nothing and no one. "Who else could be here?" muttered Daniel, looking around more nervously. "Don't worry, it's just an animal. Let's keep walking," Laura said, though her words lacked the confidence she had had before. By the time they returned to the cabin, night had already begun to fall and the sense of unease intensified. That night, terror did not take long to arrive. During dinner, Laura and Daniel tried to talk about anything to distract themselves, but something in the air made the words feel empty. It was after dinner, when Daniel sat down in the chair by the fireplace, that they heard a creak again, but this time louder, almost above their heads. The two looked at each other, their eyes full of dread. "What was that?" asked Laura, her voice trembling. "I think something is on the ceiling." Daniel got up quickly, looking up anxiously. It's impossible." The noises continued. As they intensified, they began to hear what seemed like footsteps dragging on the ceiling, heavy as if someone was walking on the wooden beams. The thought that someone could be there watching them caused terror to take hold of them. "We have to get out of here," Laura said, visibly terrified. "But we can't. We are very far from anywhere. We have no other options. Maybe it's just the wind or an animal. We're going to close everything, lock the gates, and wait for it to happen." Paranoia began to creep into their minds, as the sense that they were not alone became more and more palpable. Upon returning to their room, the sound of something hitting the windows made them jump in fear. "The window. Look at the window," Laura whispered, pointing to the window. Something dark and blurry moved on the other side. Fear gripped them as the sound of scratching on the window continued. Laura tried to take a closer look, but she couldn't see anything. However, he felt that something was stalking them from the outside. "We have to go now," exclaimed Daniel, clutching his jacket in despair. "Come on, Laura, come on." But when they both tried to open the door to escape, something stopped them. The door wouldn't budge. It was sealed from the outside. Panic set in when they discovered they couldn't open the door. They tried with all their might, but the lock seemed to have been locked from the outside. Laura, her face pale, began to breathe rapidly, her mind working at 1,000 miles an hour. Daniel stared at her desperately, trying to find a solution, but all he saw was darkness and the creaking of wood around them. "We can't stay here. Something is not right. What the hell is going on?" said Daniel, sweating and looking anxiously into every corner of the room. Suddenly, the lamplight went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. The creaking of the wood coming from the ceiling now felt closer, as if someone was slowly descending, approaching them. Both of them, paralyzed with fear, approached the window, but something in the air told them that looking outside would only make things worse. "We have to get out of here no matter what it takes," Laura said in a trembling voice. Laura began to bang on the window with all her might, but the glass would not give way. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the darkness outside, its dark outline silhouetted against the dim moonlight. Daniel screamed, but the voice choked in his throat as he saw the silhouette moving through the trees, watching them mercilessly. "What is that?" "Who's there?" asked Laura, her voice breaking. There was no response, only the growing sense that something horrible was about to happen. The figure stood there, motionless, its eyes fixed on them. Panic began to engulf them as they tried to find a way out, but the feeling that they were being watched only intensified. "Help me!" shouted Laura, finally giving in to the terror that consumed her. But there was no response. The world seemed to have stopped, and the only sound was the rustling of trees swaying in the wind. Without warning, the figure disappeared into the trees. Daniel breathed heavily, trying to process what he had just seen. The figure that had been lurking around the hut seemed to fade into nothingness, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Something was not right. There was something they couldn't see, but around them, like a presence seeping through the shadows, lurking. The clock on the wall made an almost imperceptible sound, but loud enough to break the absolute silence. Laura and Daniel looked at each other in terror, the words getting stuck in their throats. "We can't stay here," Daniel muttered as he tried to think of a way out. "We have to find a way out." With their hearts racing, they began to look for any possible way to escape. But it was at that moment that the door burst open, as if something had unlocked it from the outside. Moonlight immediately poured in, illuminating the room in eerie shadows. The figure was gone, but the sense of danger was stronger than ever. Without thinking twice, Daniel and Laura left the cabin in a hurry, running into the woods without looking back. The ground was wet and branches hit their faces as they ran frantically. They could hear footsteps behind them, the rustling of branches and leaves moving. They didn't know if it was the figure chasing them or something more sinister, but they didn't dare to look. "Run, Laura! Run!" shouted Daniel, feeling his breath ragged. Anxiety consumed them, and every second it seemed like something was catching up with them. But when they turned to see if there was anything behind it, the figure was gone. There was no trace of anything, only the thick fog that began to envelop them. The trees, which had once seemed harmless, now stood like dark giants, and the darkness of the forest seemed to devour them. There was no visible path, no lights, only the thick gloom that surrounded them. Daniel and Laura reached the edge of the forest, where the road seemed distant as if they could never reach it. The feeling of dread consumed them, but at that moment, Laura fell to her knees, exhausted and trembling. "What's going on? Why can't we get out of here?" sobbed Laura, looking out over the woods where the shadows moved as if they were alive. Daniel tried to comfort her, but he also felt the growing despair. Something was catching them, something much bigger than them, something they couldn't understand. Suddenly, a heart-rending scream echoed through the air, a voice that was not human. Something appeared on the threshold of the trees, a tall figure shrouded in darkness. His face was an indescribable shadow, but his eyes, two empty abysses, shone with a frightful intensity. The figure was watching them, and something in his eyes made their skin stand on end. "No, it can't be," shouted Daniel, as the figure slowly advanced towards them. Fear paralyzed them. They didn't know what that thing was or where it had come from. They only knew that they could not escape. The air around them thickened, as if time itself had stopped. The figure raised his arm, pointing at them, and a barely audible whisper could be heard in the wind. Laura and Daniel's name was whispered in their ears like a distant echo. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet began to shake, and an invisible force pushed them to the ground. Fear turned to absolute terror. They were no longer in the same place. They had been transported to another world, a gloomy and dark place, where the trees twisted into grotesque shapes, and the air was thick and oppressive. The empty-eyed figure slowly approached them, its shadow enveloping them, and with one swift motion took them, absorbing them in the darkness. The cabin, the forest, everything disappeared in a breath, and all that remained was the sound of the wind, carrying with it the whispers of those who had been observed, until they could never be reached. A group of 5 friends, all with hiking experience, decided to go on a trip to the Shadow Hill Forest. They had heard the stories and legends that haunted that place since they were children. Stories that spoke of unexplained disappearances, of people who never returned after entering the forest. However, what originally seemed to be a challenging adventure would quickly turn into a nightmare that would test not only his bravery, but his deepest fears. The sun was beginning to set when they reached the edge of the Shadow Hill Forest. The treetops formed a dark blanket that blocked much of the light. Despite the sinister reputation of that place, the 5 friends did not let fear stop them. They were used to walking in nature, and they believed that stories were just that, stories. They decided to camp near a clearing, a small open area between the trees, which offered them a quiet view of the starry sky. They prepared to spend a relaxed night surrounded by nature, not knowing that this would be the last moment of calm they would experience. As the night wore on, the shadows of the forest seemed to lengthen, and a strange stillness came over the place. None of the friends could remember exactly when it started, but something changed in the air. The wind stopped blowing, and a deep silence invaded the space. Suddenly, one of the group members, Sarah, felt someone watching her. He turned toward the forest, looking for some sign, but saw nothing but the impenetrable darkness of the trees. "Did you hear that?" asked Sarah, her voice trembling slightly. The others were silent, listening intently, but there was no response. Everything was too quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. A few minutes later, the silence was broken by the sound of something rustling in the distance, as if someone were walking through the dry foliage. "It's just the wind," Mark said, trying to sound confident, but his tone wasn't as convincing as he thought. Suddenly, a piercing scream broke the stillness, coming from somewhere nearby. They all got up, terrified, looking around. The sound was so close, but they couldn't see anything. "What was that?" muttered John, his voice raspy on. The group decided that it would be best to leave the camp and return to the starting point, but something prevented them from moving. A sense of unease bound them to the ground, as if the forest would not let them escape. That's when something strange began to happen. Sarah, the most intrepid of the group, stepped forward and began to walk into the woods. "I'm going to investigate," he said without hesitation. The others tried to stop her, but something in her eyes made them hesitate. She seemed to be being drawn to something beyond her comprehension. Suddenly, Sarah disappeared into the trees, as if the forest itself had swallowed her. His friends called his name, but there was no answer. The darkness swallowed all sound, and panic began to take hold of them. "Sarah!" Mark shouted desperately, running to where he had last seen her. But when he reached the edge of the forest, he found only a series of strange footprints, deeply marked on the ground, which disappeared into the blackness of the forest. There was no trace of her. The friends stared at the footprints, terrified. They knew something wasn't right, but the darkness prevented them from seeing beyond. They decided to look for it, but as they went along, the atmosphere of the forest seemed to become denser. as if they were being watched by something they couldn't comprehend. The footprints were getting stranger, as if something had painted them on purpose. "This doesn't make sense," muttered Emma, who was visibly shaking. "Why are there symbols on trees?" The symbols were strange, incomprehensible, with geometric shapes that did not correspond to any culture they knew. The figures seemed to move subtly as if they had a life of their own. The feeling that someone or something was stalking them intensified. Every time they approached one of the symbols, a cold current ran through their bodies, and a shiver ran through them. The group, now completely nervous and not knowing what to do, decided to return to the camp to think of a plan. But when they arrived, something worse awaited them. The camp was completely messy. The backpacks were open, the equipment was scattered on the ground, and the campfire had already been extinguished. The scariest thing, however, was the fact that Sarah's footprints were still there. But instead of disappearing into the forest, they were returning to the camp, surrounding the area where they were now. "What's going on here?" John whispered, his eyes filled with terror. A low, almost imperceptible whisper hung in the air. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. "Help! Help! Help!" he repeated, echoing like an echo. "It's Sarah," shouted Emma, hoping she was still nearby. But the echo only multiplied, repeating the name of each member of the group, distorted and sinister. In the background, something moved quickly among the trees. A low whistle, like that of a creature in the dark, cut through the air. Panic broke out. Suddenly, Mark disappeared. None of them saw him leave, but when they turned their heads to look for him, he was gone. Only the footprints remained, which seemed to crawl into the forest, into the deep and unreachable. With terror running high, the group began to run, but every step they took seemed to be in vain. The forest, which had at first seemed like a challenge, now closed in on them like a trap. Darkness enveloped them. Branches creaked as if something was moving quickly, and the voices of their missing comrades echoed in their ears. One by one, the figures of friends began to disappear. First Emma, then John, and finally only Clara remained, looking around in horror, unable to comprehend what was happening. She looked up at the sky, looking for the moon, looking for the light, but everything seemed to get even darker. The ground beneath his feet began to shake. And then, he saw it. From deep within the forest, a tall, thin figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't human, but it wasn't a beast either. His face was covered by a black cloak, and his eyes shone with a deep, piercing green glow that seemed to pierce his soul. The creature raised a hand, and Clara felt a pressure in her chest, an excruciating pain that forced her to fall to her knees. "Welcome, Clara," whispered a deep, guttural voice, as if coming from the very bowels of the forest. "You're the last." With a final scream, Clara disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. The forest of Shadow Hill had claimed its last victim. The echoes of the lost voices echoed through the air, while the symbols on the trees shone with a spectral light. No one else came back from that forest. And the cycle continued, waiting for new unwary people who, like the group of hikers, would challenge the legend and disappear one by one into the darkness of Shadow Hill. It was a gray afternoon when Emily, exhausted from the long journey, decided to take an alternate route on her way home. The deserted road stretched for miles, surrounded by growing darkness. There were no signs of life or other vehicles, only the roar of the wind and the distant chirping of crickets. The engine of her car echoed in the stillness of the landscape, and she took the opportunity to relax. As she drove, she began to feel a strange sensation, as if she were being watched. She shook her head and told herself that it was just tiredness. However, something was not right. His phone above the passenger seat vibrated suddenly. Emily frowned at the screen. He didn't recognize the number, but decided to answer, hoping it was an important call. "Hello, who's talking?" she said in a tired voice, trying to sound calm. At first, there was no response, just the sound of heavy breathing on the other end of the line. Emily raised an eyebrow, puzzled. "Hello?" he repeated, looking at the phone with growing uneasiness. Finally, a trembling voice emerged from the darkness on the other end of the line. "Help me. Please," said the male voice, full of despair. "I'm trapped. I don't know where I am. There's something here. Something that is looking at me. He's chasing me." Emily felt a wave of discomfort run down her spine. The voice was distorted, as if the man was in a dark, terrifying place. "Who are you?" he asked, his pulse racing. Fear was beginning to creep into his voice. Before he could receive an answer, the call was abruptly cut off. leaving only the echo of the stranger's heavy breathing. Emily, her hands sweaty, looked at her phone for signs of life, but there was nothing. There were no messages, no missed call logs, just the blank screen. He stared at his phone for a few seconds, his mind racing for answers. Just a joke, he thought. It must be someone playing with me. However, a strange sensation lingered in the air. She decided to continue on her way, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Over the next few days, Emily tried to forget what happened, blaming it on the stress and fatigue of the trip. However, something inside him told him not to ignore it. She was used to being alone on her travels, but she had never felt anything so unsettling. The latent sense of danger never went away. One night, after arriving at her apartment, Emily checked her phone and saw something that left her paralyzed. A message without a sender or any information. When he opened it, he saw a recording. She played it without knowing why, as if something pushed her to do it. The audio that began to play was the same as that of the mysterious call. The same desperate voice, the same gasping breath. But what made her tremble with terror wasn't just the voice. It was the sound of a whisper filtering through the end of the recording. Something enigmatic, almost inaudible, but clearly audible to anyone paying attention. "Don't look back," the whisper said like a warning. A shiver ran through his body. Suddenly he realized that there was something much more sinister behind that call. Something dark that was following her. But I couldn't let it go. I couldn't ignore it. He decided to investigate. However, I had no idea what I was about to discover. Emily began to go through her phone logs, looking for something that might lead her to understand what had happened on the road. When he accessed the call history, something strange happened. There on the list, he saw the call from the unknown number, but with a peculiar detail. The time she was received did not coincide with the time she had been behind the wheel. It was as if the call had been recorded long before she answered it. The mystery increased, but something worse awaited her. That same night, Emily began receiving text messages. They were short, meaningless, but chilling. "You're closer than you think," said the first. The following message came shortly after. "Don't leave the house." Another, an hour later. "Time is running out." The messages intensified as the days progressed. Emily couldn't ignore them. She began to feel like she was being watched constantly, even though there were no obvious signs that anyone was around. At all hours, I felt the presence of a shadow, something I couldn't see but that was always lurking. The situation escalated when, one morning, Emily woke up with the feeling that something was not right. The air was dense, as if the atmosphere itself were charged with electricity. When she got out of bed and looked out the window, she saw something that left her paralyzed. On the other side of the street, in the gloom, there was a figure. Tall, thin, motionless. A figure she couldn't identify, but who seemed to be staring at her. Panic took hold of Emily. He closed the curtains quickly, trying to calm himself. I needed to get out of there. He didn't know where he would go or what he would do, but he felt that his life was in danger. He picked up his phone and saw one more notification, a message with an attachment. The file was a photo taken from his own window, showing his figure looking out. The tall and slender figure was now closer. So close that I could see her eyes, which glowed in the dark. In a fit of desperation, Emily ran to her car and drove to the place where she had first received the call. The deserted road, now covered in a thick fog, seemed even more unsettling than before. When he arrived at the scene, he turned on the car's lights, looking for any sign of what had happened. There, in the darkness, he saw something on the ground. It was his phone. The phone I'd forgotten. The phone that had witnessed everything that had happened. Upon picking it up, the device turned on its own, and a new notification appeared. "You are too close to finding out the truth. Now there is no turning back." A heart-rending scream filled the air, and Emily felt something horrible loom over her. The phone began to make a strange sound, as if something was happening on the other end of the line. However, there was no one there. Everything was silent, except for the sound of his own breathing, quickened by fear. Emily tried to run, but the ground began to shake under her feet. At that moment, a dark figure emerged from the fog. It was the same being in the photo, his face deformed and his gaze fixed on her. She had no human face, only empty eyes that stared at her with terrifying intensity. The figure moved forward, sliding on the ground, and Emily, paralyzed with terror, tried to scream. But his voice did not come out. Only the sound of fog and heavy breathing surrounded her. The phone fell to the floor, and with it all hope. The figure caught up with her, and Emily disappeared into the darkness, absorbed in the terror that had haunted her from the moment she answered that call. The investigation that followed was puzzling. The phone, which was found at the scene, contained more messages, some sent before Emily's disappearance, others after. The recordings and photos she had received indicated that someone had been following her from the moment she accepted that call. No one knew who was behind the threat, but the case remained unsolved. The authorities never found a concrete clue, and the forgotten phone remained stored as a macabre memory of the inexplicable. Emily's disappearance became a legend, a horror story whispered in the dark, where the forgotten phone was the key, and the figure in the fog, the eternal nightmare that haunted those naive enough to answer an unknown call. Whitehaven Island, a small, isolated piece of land in the middle of the murky waters of the North Sea, had been a mystery for years. For a long time, the few inhabitants who remained on its shores lived a quiet life, without much contact with the rest of the world. The island, though small and modest, was steeped in ancient history, full of secrets buried under layers of land forgotten by time. But all that changed on a gray autumn afternoon when a group of tourists, in their eagerness to know the place and its mysteries, decided to venture on the island without knowing what awaited them. The group never returned. Local authorities, alarmed by the unexplained disappearance, sent several expeditions in search of the tourists, but never found a trace of their presence. Weeks turned into months, months into years, and the case of the missing from Whitehaven went from front-page news to a story forgotten by most. No one knew what had happened on the island. However, the rumors did not stop. 5 years after the group's demise, things began to change. Stories were whispered among the locals of strange sightings and unexplained occurrences. Bright lights on the darkest nights, shadows moving through the trees, and unmistakable voices in the breeze that seemed to carry echoes of something lost. However, what most terrified those who lived in the vicinity was the growing number of stories about people who said they had returned from the island. People who had disappeared for years, but now walked the streets of the town again. At first, people thought they were simple coincidences, but as time progressed, the stories became more disturbing. No one seemed to be able to explain the return of the disappeared, let alone the strange behaviors exhibited by those who claimed to have returned. Many people were skeptical, but those who met these people soon began to feel a chill running down their spine. The people who returned were not the same. There was something deeply altered in their eyes, something that made them seem different, empty, as if they were living in a parallel reality, completely disconnected from the life they had known before. The whole town began to murmur. No one knew what had happened on Whitehaven Island. No one knew what had changed those tourists who at first seemed to be ordinary people. A sense of fear and distrust took hold of the locals, and those returning from the island could not fit in. There was something inhuman about them, something that couldn't be explained in words. At first, those affected tried to continue with their lives, trying to reintegrate into the village and their former circles. However, over time, their behaviors became more bizarre and puzzling. Some of them were talking about things that no one understood, as if they were repeating the same phrases in a forgotten or unintelligible language. Others were silent, with an empty and disconnected expression, as if they could not remember anything from their previous life. The people close to them were beginning to feel a sense of unease, as if something dark and dangerous was surrounding them. The town's mayor, concerned about the growing number of incidents, called a meeting in the central square. On the night before the meeting, one of the returnees, a woman named Clara, disappeared again without a trace, only to appear at dawn in the center of the village, covered in dirt and with a completely empty expression. The few witnesses who saw her came to an agreement. Something had changed inside her, something deeply disturbing. At the meeting, the villagers were frantically arguing about what to do with those who returned. Some believed they should be isolated. Others feared they might be a threat. Panic took hold of everyone when the stories began to arrive more frequently. No one knew if those who were returning were really the people who had disappeared, or if something else had taken them, altering them, transforming them into something else. It was at that moment that a young researcher named Samuel arrived in town. Samuel was a freelance journalist, known for his desire to unravel the darkest mysteries, and he had heard about the strange happenings in Whitehaven. He decided to travel to the island to discover the truth behind the returnees. With the approval of the local authorities, Samuel boarded a small boat to the island. As he approached the shore, he couldn't help but feel that something in the air was deeply wrong. The sky was covered by dark clouds, and the sea seemed more violent than normal. Whitehaven Island, which had once been quiet, now seemed to radiate an unsettling energy. Upon arrival, Samuel began to explore the island. In his first steps, he noticed something strange. The place was deserted with no signs of life, as if the island itself had been forgotten by time. But as he moved further inland, Samuel realized he wasn't alone. I could feel it. Something was watching his movements, walking among the trees and moss-covered rocks. Samuel found what looked like a cave hidden among the hills. Intrigued, he went into it. Darkness enveloped him as he advanced through the narrow passage. And then, at the bottom of the cave, he saw something that left him cold. A set of strange symbols were etched into the walls of the cave, symbols that did not belong to any known culture. They were ancient, so profoundly old that they defied human logic. As Samuel watched them, a sense of anguish came over him. He felt as if something was awakening in the depths of the island, something he had been waiting for centuries. Suddenly the cave began to tremble, and a strange vibration ran through his entire body. Samuel tried to get out, but the walls seemed to move, closing around him. It was then that he heard voices, soft at first, like a whisper in the distance. The voices grew louder, closer, until suddenly they stopped. And then he saw something he would never forget. The missing tourists, the same ones who had returned to the village, were standing in front of him, their eyes empty and their bodies motionless. They were there, but they were not the same. Something had transformed them. Something had possessed them. At that moment, Samuel understood what had happened. The island had not only been a place of isolation, it had been a point of convergence, a space where dark forces had infiltrated the human world. The people who returned were not human. They had been altered, possessed by an ancestral entity that controlled them. And that entity had been patiently waiting for his return. As the island began to crumble around him, Samuel tried to flee but couldn't. Darkness surrounded him, and the voices of the missing were transformed into deafening screams. The cave swallowed it all, and Whitehaven Island, with all its secrets and horrors, was sealed forever. The villagers never heard of Samuel again. The returnees, if they could still be called that, continued to wander the streets, their gaze empty and their soul lost forever. And the island, with its hidden terror, continued to wait for the next victim. Night hung over the house with an eerie stillness, silence only interrupted by the occasional sound of a branch hitting the window. Laura was in her living room, embraced by the gloom that filtered through the curtains. The dim light of the table lamp dimly illuminated the book in his hands. In those moments of loneliness, I always found solace in the pages of a good novel, an escape from the daily grind. Tonight, however, something seemed different, something in the air that he couldn't clearly identify. The wall clock struck 9, and Laura heard a noise that broke the tranquility, a soft knock, as if someone were knocking on the door. He got up from the couch and walked toward the entrance, a slight feeling of discomfort running down his back. I never expected visitors at that time. He looked out the window before opening the door, but saw no one. A shiver ran through his body, though he tried to ignore it. After all, it could be children playing or someone in the wrong house. He opened the door, and there he was, a man standing in his doorway. He had a serious appearance, with a dark jacket and a hat that partially covered his face. Laura stared at him, bewildered. She didn't recognize him, but there was something in his eyes that seemed strangely familiar. "Good evening," the man said in a deep but calm voice. "Laura, right?" Laura frowned, overwhelmed by a growing sense of unease. "Yes, but I don't know you. How do you know my name?" The man smiled slightly, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "I told you, Laura. We know each other, even if you don't remember it." Laura blinked, confused. What was he talking about? She had never seen that man in her life. How could I meet her? The air in the room seemed to have become dense, as if the atmosphere itself was being charged with something indescribable. "I'm sorry, but I can't help you," Laura said, trying to remain calm as she took a step back. "I don't know you." The man stood there, motionless, watching her with an uncomfortable intensity. Without saying a word, his eyes flashed for a moment with a strange light. Laura, feeling the weight of the situation, tried to close the door. But before he could, the man stepped forward, preventing him from doing so. "You don't need to be nervous," she said with an eerie calm. "I just want to talk. It's important." Laura's heart began to pound. She didn't understand what was happening, but something inside her was telling her to be alert. The feeling of being watched intensified, and the house, which had once been her refuge, suddenly seemed like a strange alien place. "What do you want?" he asked in a thin voice, trying to stay in control. The man stared at her before answering. "Come with me. There are things you need to remember." A shiver ran down Laura's spine. What things should I remember? The feeling of fear invaded her completely, but at the same time she couldn't help but feel intrigued. Something about the way the man spoke made her feel like she couldn't just refuse him. "I'm going to call the police if you don't leave," he finally said, unable to hide the anxiety in his voice. But the man didn't seem to flinch at the threat. "You can do it if you prefer," he replied with unsettling calmness, "but it won't change anything." Laura felt a growing pressure in her chest. The need to understand what was happening prompted her to take a step back, reluctantly allowing her into her home. The man walked into the room with terrifying naturalness, as if he had been there thousands of times before. "I shouldn't have," Laura muttered to herself, though she knew it was too late. The door closed with a dull sound, and the house was filled with an ominous calm, as if time itself had stopped. The air seemed denser, and the darkness thicker. She sat down on the couch, unable to take her eyes off the man. He sat down in front of her, his arms folded, staring at her. "What I want you to remember is that," he finally said. "Remember what you forgot." Laura frowned, completely bewildered. "I don't understand what you're talking about. I don't know you. Who are you?" The man stared at her, and for an instant, Laura saw something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. It was as if there was a connection between them, something deep and ancient that I couldn't comprehend. The feeling of dread grew inside him. "I am someone from your past," he replied, his voice deeper. "Someone who knows you better than you think, and something you forgot comes looking for you." Laura didn't understand what was happening, but the man's words echoed in her mind. Something in his tone, in his gaze, caused a feeling of deep terror to take hold of her, a primitive fear, as if something that had been hidden for a long time was about to be revealed. "Leave me alone," he said, rising quickly from the couch. But when she turned to the door, a piercing cry stopped her. "You can't run away from who you are." The scream echoed throughout the house, and at that moment Laura felt as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. He looked at the man in horror, feeling the air grow even denser, as if his own breath was getting heavier and heavier. "What do you want from me?" he murmured, his voice trembling, unable to comprehend what was happening. The man slowly got up, approaching her unhurriedly, as if he knew there was no escape. "What I want you to remember is that you remember everything you have forgotten." Laura backed away, but the shadows of the house seemed to envelop her, barring any attempt to flee. His heart was pounding, and a cold sweat ran down his forehead. The man looked at her with that same frightful calmness, and at that moment, she understood something that made her blood run cold. She was no longer alone.